Hi there. This is the next episode of History for Sleep. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most famous and devastating conflicts of the ancient world, the Peloponnesian War. If you've never heard of it, this was the long and bitter struggle between Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful city-states in ancient Greece. It lasted nearly 30 years, and it wasn't just a war of armies, but of ideas, democracy against military discipline, trade against tradition, open seas against closed walls. The war began in the 5th century BCE, at a time when Athens had built a great empire and Sparta led a powerful alliance on land. What followed was a generation of fighting that left Greece exhausted, divided, and forever changed. Historians still study it as a turning point, the moment when the golden age of Greece came to an end, and we know so much about it thanks to one man, the historian Thucydides, who lived through it and wrote what might be the first true work of history. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to fall asleep or to learn something new about the ancient world, I'm glad you're with me. Now, let's begin. The decade that followed the defeat of the great king remade the Greek world. In the spring sunlight after the battles of Plataea and Mycale, Athenians looked out from the Acropolis upon a city that had been burned to its stones and yet was surging with new confidence. Sparta stood triumphant as the most respected land power in Greece, but its policymakers were cautious. Its kings and ephors instinctively wary of ventures that lay far from the Eurotas Valley. Athens was different. Themistocles had built a fleet that had broken the Persian line at Salamis. That fleet, and the artisans who maintained it, had become the backbone of a new kind of Greek strength. The Athenians understood that command of the sea meant command of corridors of grain, timber, silver, and ideas. In that understanding lay the seed of a rivalry that would grow into a long and ruinous war. The formation of the alliance, later called the Delian League, gave visible structure to this shift. In the year after Mycale, a congress of Greeks met among the islands and chose Athens to lead further operations against the great king. The treasury was set on Delos, in a sanctuary that carried a religious gravity meant to reassure all parties that the common fund would serve the common cause. Contributors brought ships or money, and the first assessment was recorded with the neat regularity of a city clerk. Under the early leadership of Cimon, son of Miltiades, the League won victories that fully cleared the Aegean of Persian garrisons. At the Eurymedon River, Athenian triremes struck with such force that they captured or destroyed a fleet and then shattered a land army on the same day. These exploits made Athens a magnet for allies seeking protection and a target for those who disliked the tone that comes with command. From the beginning, there was tension between alliance and empire. Some communities preferred to pay rather than maintain ships. Others tired of patrols and tribute and tried to slip the leash. Naxos attempted to leave the league and was forced back, its walls pulled down and its ships taken. Thasos resisted after a quarrel over Thracian mines and trading posts and was besieged into submission. Each episode made the logic of the League plainer and harsher. If the war against Persia was to be carried on, the flow of revenue and the obedience of members could not be optional. The language of common cause remained, but the practice moved toward administration by Athenian decree. Clerices were planted on allied soil, not as colonies independent of the mother city, but as outposts of citizens who kept the franchise at home. Athenian coinage, weights, and measures began to appear across the islands, a quiet assertion that the market itself would carry the imprint of the city on the Ilissos. Athenian ambitions were not confined to the water. The long walls that yoked city to port were raised with energy and speed, an engineering solution to a strategic problem. With stone and labor, Athens tied itself to the harbors of Piraeus and Phaleron, creating a fortified corridor that allowed grain and goods to enter even in the presence of hostile hoplites beyond the Attic plain. The walls were the physical expression of a strategy that treated the navy as shield and sword, a strategy that would define the city's conduct when war finally came. These works required money, and the money flowed from assessments on the allies and from the silver of Laurian. Pericles, who rose to prominence after the death of Cimon and the eclipse of rival statesmen, set that money to work in art, as well as fortification. Temples rose on the Acropolis. Master craftsmen refined orders and proportions with a discipline that matched the drill of a rowing crew. The city that had suffered fire in the days of Xerxes became a stage upon which power and beauty were meant to be read together. Sparta watched all this with a cool eye. The Peloponnesian League that it led was older and looser than the Athenian system. It rested not on tribute lists and clericies, but on oaths of mutual defense and on the reputation of Spartan infantry. Corinth and Elis and other allies valued Spartan steadiness and feared Spartan displeasure. Yet Sparta was not a city eager to campaign across the sea. It maintained a rigid social order in which a large population of helots worked the land. The stability of that order had to be guarded at all times. When an earthquake of unusual violence struck Laconia in the year often dated to 464, helots and some perioikoi rose in revolt and seized positions in the hills. The crisis shook the Spartan state to its core. Appeals for help went out, and Athens, proud of its alliance and eager to display virtue alongside power, sent hoplites under Cimon to assist. What happened next cut through the veneer of unity that had survived the Persian emergency. The Spartans, who had invited several allies, dismissed the Athenians alone. The decision, captured in the spare prose of Thucydides, was rooted in fear that Athenian enterprise and sympathy for the oppressed would complicate the suppression of the revolt. To the Athenians, it was an insult that could not be forgotten. On his return, Cimon was censured, and the political balance in Athens shifted toward men who were less patient with Spartan caution. The breach had been opened by an act of distrust at a moment of shared danger. It made later quarrels harder to manage, and gave each side a story to tell about the other's character. The years between the earthquake and the formal peace of 445 formed a laboratory for the two systems in contention. Athens sent an expedition to Egypt at the request of a local rebel against Persian rule. The undertaking ended in catastrophe after a long siege on the Nile. A large force was lost, and for a time the city measured the limits of its reach. Yet even in failure, Athens displayed the habit of a maritime empire. It could launch fleets on short notice. It could replace ships through assessments. It could continue to patrol the seas and to compel obedience from members who drifted. Sparta did not imitate such ventures. Its power remained greatest where hoplites could march and form in ranks on level ground. It could punish a Peloponnesian city that defected and could stiffen the resolve of allies with a single rumor of a king on the march. But it could not project sustained force across water without help from Corinthian or other allied sailors. The contrast in methods was not a matter of style. It was a matter of geography, economy, and social order. Pericles and his circle tightened administration over the League in a way that made sense from the vantage of the Pnyx and looked menacing from the harbors of the islands. The transfer of the League treasury from Delos to Athens occurred about the middle of the century. The official reason invoked security, for Persian raids had not vanished. The practical result was to place the keys to the common chest in Athenian hands. Tribute lists were carved in stone for all to see. Assessment revisions were made with the precision of a tax clerk. When a member city failed to pay or refused to supply ships, the answer was often a squadron of triremes at its quay and the arrival of Athenian magistrates to supervise. These were not accidental gestures. They were the habits of an imperial administration learning its craft. Beneath the surface of intercity politics lay the pressure of culture and prestige. Athens drew artists and philosophers and sophists into an urban life that glittered. Dramatic festivals celebrated civic myths and probed civic faults. Sculptors carved marble that seemed to breathe. Men from distant islands came to study rhetoric or to sell goods on the quays of Piraeus. Money changed hands in volumes unknown a generation earlier. Sparta stood as a deliberate contrast. It prized restraint, equal messes, and a severe education. It discouraged long journeys and mistrusted luxury. To many Greeks, the Spartan way seemed admirable in its austerity. To others, it looked like a denial of gifts that the gods themselves had bestowed. These judgments were not idle. They informed alliances, sharpened resentments, and gave moral coloring to disputes over harbors and borders. The League leaders met allies and ambassadors in council chambers that echoed with quarrels over Megarian decrees, Corinthian complaints, and island revolts. Each quarrel had a local cause, a disputed boundary, a fine imposed for piracy, a harbor toll. Yet each quarrel also touched a larger fear. In the words Thucydides set down, it was the growth of Athenian power and the alarm it caused in Sparta that made war inevitable. One does not need the stark language of inevitability to see the iron chain of cause and effect. A city that builds long walls and moves a sacred treasury can hardly expect its rivals to sleep easily. A state that must keep a large subject population in check can hardly welcome the example of an enterprising and democratic sea power at its door. By the end of this first phase, Athens had transformed a wartime alliance into an empire recognizable in its coinage, its clericies, its patrol routes, and its tribunals. Sparta had preserved the loyalties of a league that respected its spear and shield and relied on its composure in crisis. The two systems had hardened. The leaders on either side had tested one another in embassies and on siege lines and had learned lessons that they would use again. The Greeks had turned from repelling a foreign invader to managing a rivalry within their own family of cities. And the habits formed in those years would shape the calculations of every council that followed. The armistice that Greeks later called the 30 Years' Peace was conceived as a wall against chaos. It was not a friendship treaty, and it did not end rivalry, but it offered rules that might channel rivalry away from catastrophe. The agreement grew out of exhaustion after a stormy interval that historians named the First Peloponnesian War. In those years, Athens and Sparta, and the clusters of allies bound to each, had tested one another in central Greece, in the Saronic Gulf, and along the Isthmus. There had been sieges and truces that failed, alliances made and unmade, and campaigns that taught both sides how far the other would go. The settlement reached in the middle of the 5th century before the common era was brokered in the plain language of Greek diplomacy. Each league would retain its present allies. Disputes about members would be submitted to arbitration. Sacred places would be free from violence. The structure was simple, and its success depended on restraint. The peace did not arrive into a vacuum. It followed a series of events that set the tone for what came after. Athenian arms had been active far from Attica. An attempt to support a revolt in Egypt against Persian rule had ended in disaster. The loss was heavy, yet Athens recovered with the stubborn speed of a maritime state that could call on allied tribute to rebuild ships and hire crews. Closer to home, Athens had secured Megara for a time, placing garrisons that allowed Athenian hoplites to look across the isthmus at Corinthian territory. The city had also fought in Boeotia. A campaign at Coronea went badly, and the Athenians agreed to evacuate posts in the interior. This withdrawal helped make the peace possible. It recognized limits to Athenian reach on land and cleared the stage for a larger settlement with Sparta. What mattered in the settlement was the logic that it entrenched. The Peloponnesian League was to be treated as a coherent bloc under Spartan leadership. The Athenian-led Delian League, already hardening into an empire in everything but name, was to be recognized as a sphere that Sparta would not attack so long as its members did not revolt with Spartan encouragement. The Athenians gave up claims in central Greece that they had found costly to maintain, yet they kept what truly mattered to them. They retained their long walls, their fleet, and their wide arc of insular and coastal allies, from the Hellespont and the Propontis to the Cyclades and the shores of Asia Minor. For a time, this balance held. The two grand coalitions faced one another across a legal line that was meant to hold back the flood. Behind that line, life in the Greek world moved with outward normality. The Athenian democracy deepened its rhythms. Jurors were paid, which widened participation in the courts and gave the thetes, the poorest citizens, tangible stake in the system. The assembly met with a regularity that astonished foreign observers, and policy was argued in the open in a theatre of speech where citizens weighed tribute assessments, alliances, and building programs. The city invested in the Parthenon and the Propylaea. The names of sculptors and architects became part of the public conversation, as did the accounts that recorded the use of gold and marble. In the harbors of Piraeus, shipwrights measured ribs and keels, oarsmen trained to a beat, and merchants haggled over cargoes that came from the Black Sea, from Egypt, from Cyprus, and from Sicily. This outward strength had consequences for the empire that paid for it. Athens did not hide its hand. It moved the league's treasury from Delos to the Acropolis, citing the need for security, yet drawing to itself the power that comes when one city holds the funds of many. Tribute lists were inscribed and displayed. Assessment revisions were made with a scribe's cool precision. When a member city wavered or withheld, an Athenian squadron appeared. Clarukes secured strategic points and rewarded citizens with land abroad while maintaining their civic rights at home. Allied coinages gave way to Athenian standards. The empire had rules and procedures and magistrates who traveled to enforce them. These habits made allies uneasy, for they felt the difference between a league against Persia and the administration of an archipelago by decree from the Phoenix. The Spartans were not blind to the drift of things. Their own league was a fabric of oaths and traditional loyalties. The Spartan state valued order at home, above glory abroad. Its leaders measured every choice against the need to keep helots in subjection and to keep the discipline of the citizen body intact. The earthquake that had torn Laconia, and the helot rising that followed, remained in memory as a warning that a single disaster could shake the foundations. Spartan policy therefore tended to be cautious and reactive. The ephors and gerousia would allow allies to press quarrels and to speak heatedly about Athenian arrogance, yet they would delay decisions that might provoke a major war. For much of the peace period, this caution carried the day in Sparta. Nevertheless, the peace lived under constant strain. The earliest severe test came not from Sparta, but from Athens itself. The island of Samos, one of the strongest members of the Athenian alliance, quarreled with Miletus over Priene. The Athenians imposed arbitration and a democratic regime, but oligarchic leaders on Samos rebelled and found support among Persian officials in nearby Sardis. Pericles sailed with a fleet, imposed a siege, and after a long and costly campaign forced the island to submit. The terms were harsh. Ships were surrendered, fortifications were torn down, and a heavy indemnity was imposed to be paid in annual installments. The episode did more than display the resolve of the Athenian government. It showed allies that secession was not a feasible path, and showed Sparta that Athens would not permit even powerful members to redefine the league. Sparta did not intervene during the Samian War, but the debate over intervention left marks. Corinth in particular watched Athenian behavior with rising anger. Corinth was a maritime power with its own network of colonies in the west, a rival to Athenian merchants, and a city whose pride was as sensitive as that of any in Greece. In the later years of the peace, the line between Athenian and Corinthian interests became a chain of quarrels. They began with a small city on the eastern Adriatic. At Epidamnus, a colony of Corcyra, which was itself a colony of Corinth, a civil conflict broke out. Democrats were expelled, aristocrats returned with Illyrian help, and the city trembled under tribal raids. The Democrats appealed to Corcyra for aid and were refused. They then turned to Corinth, which seized the chance to insert itself into a quarrel that touched Corcyrian pride. Corinth sponsored new colonists and sent a garrison, while Corcyra prepared a fleet to enforce its claim. The lagoon blue of the Ionian Sea became the stage for a collision that rippled outward. Corcyra was no ordinary island. It possessed one of the three largest fleets in Greece. Athens was another, and Corinth the third. Corcyra was formally neutral in the great split between Sparta and Athens, yet it was connected to Corinth by legal and emotional ties that went back generations. When the crisis escalated, Corcyra sent envoys to Athens with a proposal that was as clever as it was dangerous. The Corcyrians asked for a defensive alliance. They argued that this would not violate the peace, since a defensive pact promised help only to a party who was attacked. They added that if Corinth acquired the Corcyrian ships, the balance of naval power would tilt decisively against Athens. The Athenians listened. Corinthian envoys arrived and argued with equal vigor that Athens would be breaking the peace if it joined hands with a rebellious colony against the metropolis. The Athenian assembly weighed interests and risks in the way it had been trained by long practice to do. Pericles and other leaders advised that Athens should not allow Corinth to swallow Corcyrian sea power. The decision was to conclude a defensive alliance, a middle step that preserved a legal fig leaf while making the strategic point. Athens sent a small squadron with orders to avoid combat unless Corcyra itself was attacked. The fig leaf was thin, and it was torn at Sybota. The Battle off Sybota was one of the largest naval clashes to that date. The Corinthians sailed with a powerful force that included ships from their allies. The Corcyrians formed opposite, with the Athenian squadron in support. The Corinthians pressed hard. In the confusion of timber and bronze and shouted orders, some Athenian ships intervened to prevent the collapse of the Corcyrian line. The Corinthians complained that this was an act of war. The Athenians maintained that they had acted within the terms of their defensive pledge. When the smoke and spray settled, the Corinthians claimed tactical advantage, but the immediate strategic question remained. Corinth had not been allowed to break Corcyra and add its fleet to its own. The resentment in Corinth took on a new heat. Events now moved quickly in a second theatre that touched both Corinth and Athens. Potidaea was a Corinthian colony that belonged to the Athenian alliance. The city was a hinge between the two rival spheres and sat on a finger of land that gave access to the northern Aegean and the Thracian coast. The Athenians, watching Corinthian anger rise, ordered Potidaea to pull down its seaward wall, to dismiss Corinthian magistrates, and to give hostages. The Potidaeans, caught between loyalty to their metropolis and the power of Athens, sought help from Corinth and then from Sparta. They received from Sparta a private assurance that if Athens attacked, Sparta would invade Attica. This was not a formal decree of the Spartan assembly, but it was enough to stiffen the resolve of the Potidaeans and to embolden Corinth. Athens sent forces north, first under Aristeus and then under Phormion and others, and began a siege of Potidaea that would drag on for years and consume immense sums. Corinth sent volunteers and pressed Sparta more loudly. The ledger of grievances grew longer. Each side kept its own version. The Corinthians itemized Athenian offenses. The Athenians counted Corinthian provocations and pointed to Spartan hesitation to restrain an ally. In Athens, the assembly passed the measure that history remembers as the Megarian Decree, a set of sanctions that barred Megarian merchants from the markets of the Athenian Empire and from the ports that Athens controlled. The exact clauses and their enforcement have been argued by scholars ever since, but the decree was deliberately punitive. It struck at Megarian trade and therefore at Corinthian pride and profit, because Corinth and Megara were bound by geography and by shared hostility to Athenian sea power. The decree hardened parties throughout Greece. In Sparta, the pressure to act finally overcame the reflex of caution. The Spartan authorities summoned an extraordinary congress of allies. Delegates crowded into the city to speak their complaints. Corinthians took the floor and delivered a speech that Thucydides preserves in full. They accused Sparta of slowness, of failure to check Athenian growth, of allowing an upstart sea power to humiliate Dorians throughout the islands. They spoke to Spartan honor and to Spartan fear. They did not conceal their own bitterness over Sybota and Potidaea and the freezing of Megarian trade. The Athenian envoys, who happened to be in Sparta on other business, asked and received permission to speak. They reminded the Spartans of Athenian service in the Persian War, of the logic that placed naval leadership in Athenian hands, and of the risks that would come if Sparta misjudged the balance of power. They concluded with a firm statement that Athens would not give up what it had lawfully acquired, and that it would fight if attacked. The internal debate among Spartans that followed is one of the best documented in the ancient world. Archidamus, the Spartan king who had seen much, urged caution. He spoke about the nature of war with a clarity that sounds modern. War, he said, is not a matter that can be ended at will once begun. He warned that Athens had money and ships and allies and men who had been trained to the sea. He argued that Sparta should not decide lightly, and that if it did decide, it should prepare for a long and costly effort that would require allies who could fight on water as well as on land. The Ephor Sthenelaidas pressed the opposite case. He reduced the matter to a moral plane. Athens was in the wrong, the allies were insulted, and delay was a form of surrender. He called for a simple vote on whether the Athenians had broken the peace. The Spartan assembly declared that Athens had broken the peace. This was not a formal declaration of war in the modern sense, but it allowed allied complaints to move from speeches to plans. More embassies were sent. The Spartans delivered ultimatums with phrases designed to shift blame if Athens refused. They asked that Athens rescind the Megarian decree. They asked that Athens restore autonomy to Greek cities. They asked that disputes be submitted to arbitration as the treaty required. Each demand was a thread that pulled at the fabric of empire. If Athens yielded on one, those who paid tribute would smell weakness. If it yielded on all, the empire would begin to unravel. Pericles advised the assembly to stand firm. He did not deny that the decree pinched Megara. He argued that it was a lever, and that to surrender it at the point of a Spartan demand would open the way to further demands. He counseled the city to prepare for a protracted conflict that Athens could endure, so long as it kept to a clear design. Avoid land battle against superior Spartan hoplites. Bring the rural population inside the walls. Use the fleet to harry the Peloponnesian coast and to guard the grain route from the north. Maintain the reserve fund that had been set aside years earlier. He had not sought this confrontation, but he had thought about it more than most. While embassies crisscrossed the isthmus, a spark flew in Boeotia. The Thebans, Spartan allies and rivals of Athens in central Greece, attempted a night attack on Plataea, a small town that was an Athenian ally and a symbol of old loyalties from the Persian War. The Thebans expected a gate to be opened by friends within. They found themselves trapped in dark streets and fought house to house. They were driven out. Prisoners were taken. The Plataeans, fearful of a swift return by a larger Theban force, executed the prisoners the next morning. The event shocked Greece. It was the kind of brutal arithmetic that often begins when rules no longer hold. Athens sent a garrison to Plataea. The Spartans gathered the Peloponnesian League to invade Attica in the spring. Scholars discuss whether the war had already begun in spirit before the Theban raid. The legalists of the Greek world could produce arguments either way. What mattered at the human level was that the restraint on which the treaty depended had failed. The line between spheres had frayed at Corcyra and Cybota, at Potidaea, at Megara, and now it snapped at Plataea. The congresses and embassies and ultimatums had been the last instruments of a peace that had protected a generation from inter-Hellenic disaster. Once those instruments lost authority, the gears of mobilization began to turn. On the Attic roads, one could see country people driving carts toward the city, carrying children, bedding, tools, household gods. In Piraeus, shipwrights worked without pause. In Laconia, messengers summoned contingents to assemble under the royal standard. The tragedy of the peace is that it worked until it did not. The terms were not fanciful. Arbitration and mutual recognition of alliances could have given Greece time to let the wounds of earlier wars heal. Yet the structure depended on habits of mind that the rival cities did not share. Athens believed that an empire held by law and administered by magistrates was compatible with the language of common cause. Sparta believed that restraint by one party, while the other consolidated power, would eventually leave the restrained party without choices. Corinth believed that its interests in the West and its pride as a naval power were being smothered. Megara believed that a neighbor had used commercial policy as a weapon of war. Thebes believed that local rivalries in Boeotia were a reason to risk a strike that would please Sparta and weaken Athens. Each belief had its own logic. Their convergence created the conditions for war. Pericles knew that the decision to resist would mean hardship for farmers who would watch their vines and orchards cut by enemy hands. He also knew that the sea lanes and the walls and the reserve fund had been built precisely because a day like this might come. Archidamus understood that the spear point of Sparta could pierce Attica and force Athenians to ground within their walls, but he also understood that a city supplied by sea could endure for a long time. It is one of the paradoxes of the ancient Greek world that the rival leaders whose strategies would define the opening years of the conflict were each in their way realists. They understood the nature of their own states and of their opponents. They saw that the war would not be quick, neither could prevent the slide. When the Spartan allied host crossed the border into Attica in the year that Greeks described by the names of magistrates, the 30 years' peace had become a memory. The structures of the treaty would be invoked for a time by diplomats searching for a ladder down from the wall. They would not find one. The war that began was larger than any conflict that the Hellenes had fought among themselves. It grew from the slow accretion of grievances and from the change in scale that followed the Persian invasions. It was the product of the rise of a naval empire and the fear of that rise felt by a land power that had long been first among equals. The war opened with the sound of axes in Attica. In the first campaigning season, King Archidamus of Sparta led the Peloponnesian host across the border and cut orchards and vines that had taken generations to bring to maturity. The Spartan way of war was deliberate. The army assembled by tribes and cities marched to a set rhythm and sought to draw the enemy into a land battle where the shield wall of disciplined hoplites could decide the day. The Spartans had reasons to believe this method would work. On open ground, their citizen infantry and their Peloponnesian allies had long been the measure of Greek strength. They judged that if they devastated the Athenian countryside and stood ready near the walls, the anger of displaced farmers would force the assembly to fight. It was a sound expectation in the age before the long walls and the great fleet altered the geometry of power. Pericles refused the lure. He had laid the groundwork for this refusal over many years. The long walls bound Athens to Piraeus with stone and ditch and tower. They were not merely defenses. They were a statement that the city would fight as a maritime power even while its fields were overrun. When Archidamus approached, the rural population came inside the circuit in wagons loaded with furniture, tools, and statues of household gods. Livestock was ferried to the islands. Temples and stoves became dormitories. Courtyards were filled with makeshift shelters. The discomfort and crowding were severe, and the old men of the farming districts muttered that a citizen should defend his fields with spear and shield. Pericles held his course. He argued that the land could be replanted and the city could not be replaced. The fleet would be the decisive arm. Athens turned to the sea with the discipline of a city that had built its identity on oar power. Squadrons sailed along the Peloponnesian coasts to ravage property of Spartan allies, to seize hostages, and to show that the enemy mainland was not a sanctuary. The best of the early campaigns belonged to Phormio, an experienced admiral who had learned how to use the wind and the narrow waters of the Corinthian Gulf. Off Patrae and near Naupactus, in the year that we count as 429, he took inferior numbers of ships and beat larger Peloponnesian fleets through skill in station-keeping and timing. He trained his captains to hold a tight circle, to wait for the enemy line to stretch and break, and then to strike the scattered ships before they could reform. These victories stiffened the spirit of the city and showed that the navy remained a sharp instrument even after the shock of invasion. The strategy had a second pillar. Athens guarded the grain road from the Black Sea to Piraeus. Triremes and allied garrisons protected the Hellespont and the Propontis. Cleruches and friendly cities in the northern Aegean were kept supplied. The assembly maintained a reserve fund measured in 1,000 talents that was not to be touched except in a mortal emergency. The population of the city, swollen by refugees, was fed with imported grain and with the fish and goods that came into the harbors every day. There were days when the quays at Piraeus looked like a floating market of the entire Aegean, with wine from the islands, timber from Macedon and Thrace, and copper and hides from distant markets. If the sea lanes could be kept open, Athens could endure. So the argument ran, and for a time it seemed to be borne out. The war on land did not go to sleep while the ships ranged abroad. The siege of Potidæa, begun before the formal outbreak, continued to drain men and money. Spartan allies pressed Athens in western Greece and in Boeotia. There were raids into Aetolia that ended in sharp reverses for Athenian hoplites unused to mountainous country. There were Athenian successes as well, such as the securing of Naupactus and patrols that kept Corinthian influence in check. But the pattern of the first years held. Sparta and its league cut Attic crops and withdrew when stores ran low or when summer heat dried the streams. Athens refused to give battle on land, relied on the walls, and carried the war to the enemy coasts with fire and alarm. Then the plague came. In the second year of the war, a sickness of unknown origin entered the crowded city and ran like fire through dry brush. Thucydides, who suffered it and survived, left a clinical account that still chills the reader. Sudden fevers, inflamed eyes, bleeding throats, racking cough, unquenchable thirst, and a rash that settled on the limbs. Physicians died in great numbers because they were the first to attend the stricken. Piety faltered when prayers seemed to bring no relief. Funeral customs broke down under the crush of the dead. Estimates vary, but many thousands perished, perhaps a quarter or more of the citizen body and a large part of the sailors and soldiers who had crowded within the walls. The moral cost was as grave as the demographic loss. Men who had saved for dowries or for funerary rites spent wildly, hoping to enjoy what the disease might soon take from them. Others retreated into private despair. The very order that Pericles had asked his people to trust was threatened by an invisible enemy. Pericles held fast. He spoke to the assembly with a kind of austere tenderness. He reminded citizens that the strategy they had adopted was the only one that did not play into Spartan hands. He told them that the city was more than its fields, and that the fleet was more than timber and bronze. He asked them to remember the spirit of the funeral oration and the meaning of a citizenship that was both a privilege and a duty. Yet the sickness did not respect eloquence, and political patience is rarely infinite. Pericles was fined and briefly set aside. He was then restored, a sign that even in rage the Athenians knew where their true advantage lay. In the end, the plague took him as well, in the year 429. The city lost not only a leader but a strategist whose clear view of resources and risks had given Athens its best chance to ride out the storm. After Pericles, a different tone began to creep into debate. The careful balance he had kept between endurance and measured aggression gave way to louder voices. Cleon, a tannery owner who spoke in the assembly with a streetwise energy, urged harsher measures against rebellious allies and more daring ventures against Peloponnesian positions. There were others who counseled moderation, men like Nicias who had seen what plague and siege could do to a city. The democracy remained vigorous and argumentative. Juries sat, magistrates were selected, accounts were audited. But the long toll of invasion and disease had changed the mood. It would soon change the choices. The Spartan coalition was not without its own strains. Annual invasions consumed resources and bored allies who expected decisive results. The failure to force Athens into a land battle produced murmurs about the wisdom of the kings. In distant regions, the war did not always favor Sparta. The capture of strategic points by Athenian squadrons along the coast and the strong Athenian presence at Naupactus checked Peloponnesian shipping in the west. Corinth pushed for a greater naval effort, but the Peloponnesians lacked both the money and the institutional experience of a true sea power. When they did take to the water in strength, as in the actions Phormio fought, they were often taught painful lessons. Life inside besieged Attica acquired a rhythm that no one desired yet all recognized. The country folk grew used to living in porticos and under the eaves of temples. Craftsmen found work in the dockyards and in the sites where public buildings rose. The spectacle of the city continued in diminished form. Tragedians presented plays that wrestled with suffering and fate before audiences where grief was no longer an abstraction. Merchants learned the schedules of the naval station lists by heart. The navy itself became the principal school of discipline for a class of citizens who found status not in landholding but in skill at the oar and the rope. This civic transformation is one of the lasting facts of the war. The balance inside Athens tilted further toward men whose fortunes were tied to the sea. By the close of the earliest phase of conflict, the broad measures of the Periclean design had held. Sparta had not broken the walls. Athens had not met the Spartans on ground of their choosing. The fleet had demonstrated mastery in confined waters and along hostile coasts. Yet the price had been fearsome. The plague cut into the ranks of sailors and hoplites and into the families that sustained them. The farms of Attica were scarred. The reserve fund was guarded, but ongoing sieges and naval stations consumed treasure with an appetite that worried every treasurer who read the monthly tallies. The choice that confronted the city was stark. It could abandon a maritime strategy and risk annihilation before superior infantry. Or it could persist on the path that had been set, accept the slow ruin of the countryside, and hope that time and money and seamanship would wear down the will of the Peloponnesian League. The Peloponnesians faced a mirror choice. They could pour allies and coin into learning the sea and attempt to break Athens on its element. Or they could continue the annual rites of invasion and hope that Athens would rupture under the strain of plague and faction. For a time, each side chose to be itself. Sparta remained a master of the land. Athens remained a master of the sea. The lines that had been drawn when the long walls first rose and when the first triremes mustered in Phaleron continued to govern the logic of the war. The first shock of invasion and the first blaze of Athenian sea raids gave way to a rhythm that was harsh and unyielding. Year after year, the countryside of Attica burned. Year after year, Athenian squadrons slipped along hostile coasts to cut vines, lift livestock, and carry off prisoners for ransom. What had opened with bold marches and quick naval maneuvers settled into a contest of endurance that weighed grain accounts, recruitment lists, and the will of citizens who woke to the same alarms each season. Potidaea was an index of this new reality. The siege began before the formal outbreak and ran on like a ledger entry that refused to close. Athenian engineers threw up lines, cut access by sea, and watched the garrison ration bread and hope. When the city fell, the cost to Athens was measured not only in lives, but in silver and in the months of pay for soldiers who had hacked at works in the Chalcidic soil rather than sail to profitable stations. The fall gave Athens a foothold in the north and secured the route toward the grain seas. Yet it also demonstrated how slowly the war would move when walls and stubborn men stood between plans and results. The plague still drifted through the crowded city and its ports, taking some districts hard and sparing others without pattern that observers could discern. Thucydides wrote that memory failed and that prayer failed, which is the historian's way of telling the depth of discouragement among the living. Within this pressure, a democracy must still decide. Elections were held. Generals were chosen. Tribute was assessed. The reserve fund was guarded with a severity that made the treasurers unpopular and respected at once. Athens learned to live in two times. There was the daily time of queues for bread and water. There was the strategic time of seasons and theaters and grain convoys. The Spartans and their allies did not find the siege of Attica a simple cure for Athenian resolve. An army that lives off the land supplies itself best in the first days of a campaign. After that, the work becomes grimmer. Forage parties must push farther, carts must be assembled, streams dry, and the heat cracks the earth. The Peloponnesian army could burn the farms of Attica and could stand within sight of the walls, but it could not force the Athenians to open the gates. The invaders went home each year to harvest and to repair, and each return march taught that Athens would not be drawn out toward a decision on the plain. The seas offered more motion. Phormio's victories in the Corinthian Gulf were followed by a series of raids that probed the Peloponnesian coast. The Athenians learned town names they had never cared to learn. They extracted levies in one harbor and moved on before the local hoplites could mass. The purpose was not only damage. It was theater of war used to convince allies that Athens still held the trident and to remind enemies that no shore was beyond the reach of a swift squadron of triremes. Athens also sought to unsettle the Peloponnesian coalition at its edges. Western Greece drew attention. Naupactus remained a key base for Athenian naval power and for loyal Messenians who knew the terrain and could strike at crossings and mountain paths. There were forays into Aetolia that showed how difficult inland fighting could be for sailors turned hoplites. A column of Athenian and allied troops pressed too far into hill country and paid for every misstep with men lost in gullies and under oak trees that hid javelin men. The lesson was plain. The city that commanded the sea could not assume equal skill in every landscape. The most striking tests of morale in these years came not in open battle, but in the hard calculus of sieges and civic revolts. Plataea stood as a symbol and a problem. It had fought beside Athens against the Persian king and had been a faithful ally. It also sat on the flank of Theban influence. The Thebans, acting in the dark hours before dawn, attempted a surprise entry through a faction within the walls. The alarm rose. The Plataeans regrouped and drove the attackers out. What followed was a long noose. The Peloponnesian army ringed Plataea with two lines, one to face the town and one to face the countryside. Engines and mounds were built. The defenders countered with mines and sorties. The siege ran on through seasons. When starvation finally did the work that stones and darts could not, the survivors faced a panel of Spartan judges who asked only whether they had done anything to help the Peloponnesians in the war. The question admitted no real defense for men who had held out for Athens. The executions that followed told the Greek world what a long war does to the old courtesies among Hellenes. In the Eastern Aegean, another drama unfolded that became a lesson read in every council house of the empire. Mytilene, the leading city on Lesbos, chafed at Athenian demands and at the spectacle of a treasury that now sat beneath the Acropolis. The city prepared walls and sought support from Sparta. Athens moved quickly. A fleet closed the harbor mouths. A land force tightened the grip. After months of strain, the city capitulated. Then came the debate that later generations would know simply as the Mytilenean debate. Cleon argued that empire rests on fear, and that revolt must be punished in such a way that no one else would dare to test Athenian patience. He proposed the execution of all adult males and the sale of women and children, a penalty that had precedence in Greek warfare, but was shocking when applied to a city of the alliance. Diodotus answered in a quiet voice that policy must be made for future advantage, and not present anger. He argued that threats of mass death do not deter, that rebels act under factions and pressures, and that it is useful to leave a path back into the alliance for cities that might repent. The assembly first voted with Cleon, then slept on the matter, then reversed itself the next day after speeches that must have felt like a test of the city's conscience. A fast ship caught up with the first boat carrying the execution order. Only the leaders of the revolt were put to death. The city was disarmed, and land was measured out to clerics. The episode revealed an empire that could be both iron and deliberative. It also revealed a democracy that could draw back from its own anger at the last possible hour. In Corcyra, another kind of misery played out. The island had already figured in the chain of events that brought war. Now it fell into stasis, the Greek word that means both civil strife and a standing still of the old order. Democratic and oligarchic factions began a cycle of accusation, retaliation, and massacre. Refugees seized shrines. Prisoners were hauled from sanctuaries. Neighbors informed on neighbors. The arrival of squadrons and the shifts in sea control turned the island into a theater for vengeance, masked as patriotism. Thucydides recorded that words themselves changed meaning under the pressure of party loyalty. The tale became a warning that the war did not only pit league against league, it tore city from city and citizen from citizen. Even routine operations had a cost that accumulated beyond the daily news of arrows and rams. Every garrison required pay. Every ship demanded wages for 200 men and repairs for wood and bronze. Every siege consumed stores laid in with painful labor. The empire had resources, and assessments were revised with care. Yet the monthly figures that the clerks carved into stone were reminders that a war of attrition is ultimately a war of accounts as well as arms. When one reads the tribute lists beside the chapters of Thucydides, one sees not only the geography of power, but the arithmetic that sustained it. The Peloponnesian leadership felt its own arithmetic grind. The allies had expected a short campaign and a humbled Athens. Instead, they saw smoke from Attic farms that felt like a ritual rather than a result. The Spartans experimented with larger raids in the west and with attempts to pry allied cities from Athens by embassies and promises. They were potent on land. They were resolute, but they did not yet possess the money or the habit to bring a naval war to a finish. Each year that passed without a decisive victory increased the temptation to seek new methods and new partners, a temptation that would have great consequences when Persian satraps began to weigh their own interests in the Greek quarrel. By the end of this early stretch, the war looked less like a row of famous battles and more like a map of sieges, garrisons, and debates. Plataea had fallen. Mytilene had been punished, but spared from annihilation. Corcyra had torn itself into factions that would require years to heal. Athens had kept the sea and the grain road. Sparta had kept the respect and obedience of the Peloponnesian land powers. Neither side had found a lever that could move the other from its chosen ground. The stalemate was not peaceful. It was a slow grinding that wore on nerves and treasuries, and on the moral imagination of cities that had once prided themselves on moderation. The middle years of the war brought forth new commanders and a change in tempo. Cautious routine gave way to improvisation on difficult terrain, to quick amphibious strikes along rocky coasts, and to political wagers inside the Athenian assembly that could elevate or ruin a career in a month. The names that recur in these chapters tell a story of method meeting nerve. Demosthenes, not the later orator but the general of these years, experimented with fieldcraft that did not fit the classical picture of a hoplite line on smooth ground. Cleon, a figure of the market with a sharp tongue and a gift for turning the mood of a crowd, pressed for bolder action. On the other side, Brasidas emerged as a Spartan who understood speed, persuasion, and the value of striking far from the usual fields of Peloponnesian strength. The year that we count as 426 showed both failure and invention. Demosthenes led an Athenian and allied force into Aetolia in the hope of breaking a ring of hostile towns and of opening a path toward Boeotia from the west. He misread the country and the enemy. The Aetolians fought as skirmishers in broken hills, and the Athenian hoplites labored under weight and heat. Guides were lost, order frayed, and the retreat turned bloody. It was a lesson that the sea power of Athens did not translate into mastery of every inland road. Demosthenes did not end his campaign there. Moving to Acarnania with the help of the loyal Messenians and local allies, he turned to the art of ambush and sudden attack. At Olpae, he drew the Ambraciots into a fight that exposed their flanks. At Idomene, he fell upon a column at dawn. The victories were not grand parade battles, but they eliminated a serious threat in the west and restored his standing. These successes set the stage for a venture that would electrify Greece. In the spring of 425, a storm drove an Athenian convoy to shelter on the Messenian coast near Pylos, a rugged headland with coves and reefs that made landings difficult. Demosthenes saw at once that the place could be fortified quickly and held with a small force. He argued that a fort at Pylos would be an iron nail in the Spartan shoe. From there, raiding parties could stir helots to run and could force Sparta to keep a watch on its own backyard. His captains grumbled that their mission lay elsewhere and that the ships were loaded for another station. He answered with dry earth piled into walls, with wooden palisades where stone could not be had, and with the energy that comes when a commander believes the ground itself offers a gift. Sparta could not ignore a hostile post on its own shore. A Peloponnesian fleet and army converged. The key to the harbor of Pylos was the long island of Sphacteria that lay like a breakwater across the entrance. In the first violent phase, the Spartans tried to storm the Athenian works from the sea and from the sand spit. A handful of Athenian marines and archers, supported by the Messenian light troops who knew every crag, held them off with stones, arrows, and short charges. The fighting was close and personal, with men slipping on wet rock and shields battered on rough walls. When the first storm passed, the Spartans placed a force of elite hoplites on Sphacteria to secure the island, while they prepared a larger assault. The Athenians answered by sending a fleet in strength. The battle inside the harbor was a confusion of rams and shattered oars. Athenian seamanship in tight water decided the day. The Peloponnesian ships were crippled or driven ashore. The Spartan hoplites on Sphacteria found themselves cut off. A siege began that was unlike the stately sieges of walled towns. The prisoners were Spartans, many of them citizens of the highest rank in their rigid order. Food and water were scarce on the island. The Athenians established a blockade and used small boats and archers to keep the stranded force under pressure. The Spartan government sued for an armistice. They offered to negotiate a larger peace if their men could be relieved. In Athens, the proposal was weighed with care. The city allowed a short truce for talks and held Peloponnesian ships as a pledge. When the talks failed and the truce was judged to have been broken by Spartan efforts to supply the island, the war resumed. The siege ran into new trouble. Summer fires burned scrub on Sphacteria and exposed the ground. The Spartan garrison adapted and settled into makeshift positions that were hard to approach. Inside the Athenian assembly, a weary impatience grew. It is here that Cleon steps into the narrative with a flourish that made him the hero of one month and the target of scorn in another. He mocked the caution of the generals and claimed that with a modest force, the thing could be finished in a few days. The assembly challenged him to take command if he spoke so confidently. He tried to refuse. Voices pressed him. He accepted with terms that allowed him to share command with Demosthenes already on the spot. He then sailed for Pylos. What followed was a study in the use of light troops against a celebrated infantry. Demosthenes had already planned to land on the island at several points with archers, javelin men, and agile fighters who could move fast over rough ground. The Athenians avoided the narrow path where Spartan shields and spears would make a slaughter. They spread along the length of Sphacteria, kept up a storm of missiles, and refused to close until the enemy line was disordered and exhausted. When the moment came, they pressed forward in small groups, climbing and circling, pricking and withdrawing, a kind of swarming that Spartan drill could not easily answer on that terrain. A Messenian guide led a detachment along a goat track to seize a height in the Spartan rear. Cut off from water and surrounded by men who gave them no rest, the Spartan hoplites did what no one in Greece expected them to do in daylight and in numbers. They laid down their shields and surrendered. The prisoners numbered 292 by the usual count, and about 120 were full Spartan citizens. The capture sent a shiver through every council from Corinth to Lesbos. The Spartan name had long rested on courage and on the resolve to conquer or die in the shield wall. That reputation was not destroyed, for the conditions were extreme, but it was bent. Athens understood what it had gained. So long as the prisoners lived in Athenian hands, Sparta would think twice before risking a massed assault into Attica. The Athenians placed guards and scattered the captives in safe places. They also renewed raids out of Pylos that stripped Laconian farms, a daily irritation that gnawed at Spartan pride and forced the deployment of watchposts near the coast. The success at Pylos and Sphacteria changed the music of the war for a season. Athens tasted the possibility of a settlement on favorable terms. Sparta sent envoys again. The assembly listened, compared demands with what victory had placed within reach, and chose to continue. At the same time, the Athenian navy struck at Cythera, an island off the Laconian shore that served as a trading and raiding station. Its fall tightened the ring of irritation around Sparta and gave Athens another base for coastal war. The policy was clear: keep the prisoners, hold the posts on the Spartan flank, use the fleet to make Peloponnesian allies doubt the ability of their leader to shield them. While the southern theater held the attention of every Greek, other lines of action continued. In the far west, the Athenian base at Naupactus remained a thorn in the side of Corinth and its friends. In Sicily, an earlier Athenian expedition under Laches and Chareades had probed the balance of power between Syracuse and its rivals and had concluded a patchwork peace. These ventures were limited compared to what would come later, yet they fed a sense in Athens that horizons beyond the Peloponnese could be shaped by timely interventions and by alliances with cities eager for support against local enemies. Amid these maneuvers, the figure of Brasidas began to rise. He had fought already in the Megarian region with energy and had shown in debate that he possessed a persuasive courage as well as skill with a spear. The lesson of Pylos made him think about asymmetry. If Athens could drive a stake into Sparta's side, then Sparta could march where Athens least expected and shatter the sense of security that came from walls and sea lanes. He would soon lead a column north into Thrace and Macedonia, and he would draw Athenian subjects to revolt, not with threats alone, but with promises and a manner that impressed even enemies. For the moment, Athens stood at a height of fortune. It is the irony of these years that the very sense of strength born at Pylos would tempt the city to decisions that lengthened the war and widened its map. By the end of 425, Athens held Spartan prisoners, controlled strategic posts off the Laconian shore, and had shown Greece a new grammar of war in which light troops, archers, and flexible landings could master even renowned hoplites when ground and plan were chosen well. Sparta absorbed the shock, measured losses, and looked for a counter that would not play to Athenian strengths. The next moves would take the fighting to the north and would draw new actors and new calculations into a war that refused to stay within old boundaries. When the fires of Sphacteria dimmed, the war did not end. It changed shape. Sparta absorbed the humiliation of captured citizens and searched for a lever that would not require a frontal collision with Athenian ships. The man who found that lever was Brasidas. He was Spartan in discipline and courage, but he moved with a speed and a suppleness that did not fit the picture of the slow Peloponnesian march. He spoke well. He knew how to reassure nervous allies and how to unsettle subjects of Athens who had grown weary of tribute and garrisons. His plan was simple in outline and daring in execution. He would take a column through Thessaly by diplomacy and speed, skirt battle with larger forces, and descend upon the Thracian and Macedonian coast where Athenian interests were richest in timber, silver, and grain routes. In that northland stood Amphipolis, a city that controlled the Strymon and the roads into the mines of the interior. In the late autumn of the year, counted as 424, he moved quickly, collecting friends in the Chalkidic Peninsula, and offered moderate terms to communities that opened their gates. His proclamations promised autonomy and fair treatment rather than plunder. Cities like Acanthus and Stagira listened. Some joined him without a fight. Athens was not blind to the danger. Thucydides, the historian, then a general, was stationed with a small force on Thassos. He sailed with 7 triremes to Aeon at the mouth of the Strymon and secured it, but he could not arrive in time to save Amphipolis itself. Brasidas had encamped before its walls and offered generous terms to residents who feared sack and enslavement. The gates were opened under a treaty. The loss shook Athens. It was not only a strategic position and access to timber and silver. It was a symbol of reach and of the empire's claim to police the northern seas. The city punished Thucydides for failure with exile, which would give him the time to write the book that defines our understanding of the war. The blow at Amphipolis emboldened others. Torone, Mende, and Sione in the peninsula wavered or revolted. The Athenians answered as they could. They sent forces under generals like Cleon to recover the lost ground and to punish those who had welcomed the Spartan. The struggle became a running campaign among towns and promontories. There were instances of promise kept and of revenge taken. Brasidas kept to the tone he had adopted, restraining his men from excess and winning praise even among those who feared him. The Athenians took Torone and Mende back with severity that reminded all of the iron that lay beneath Athenian administration. In central Greece, the war produced one of its most studied set-piece battles at Delium in Boeotia. There, an Athenian army under Hippocrates fortified a sanctuary and attempted to impose a presence inside Boeotian territory. The Boeotian levy under Pagondas formed a deep right and used a bold charge that surprised the Athenian line. A cavalry move on the Athenian left sealed the result. The Athenians were driven off with heavy loss, and the episode revealed again that on chosen ground and with proper leadership, the traditional phalanx battle still had decisive power. Among the hoplites at Delium was Socrates, who would later be remembered for a different kind of courage. Among the mounted men was young Alcibiades, who would soon find his voice in the assembly. War weariness grew on both sides. Athens had recovered prisoners at Sphacteria, but bled in Boeotia and watched the north in alarm. Sparta had avoided the fleets, but saw a hostile fort at Pylos and a base at Cythera, harrying Laconian shores. The allies of both coalitions were impatient, It was in this climate that leaders who prized stability over glory stepped forward. On the Athenian side, Nicias had long argued for careful moves and for husbanding the strength of the city. He had supported the Sphacteria armistice and favored exchanges that might lead to a general settlement. On the Spartan side, King Pleistouanax had reasons to prefer peace after years of controversy at home and the knowledge that a city cannot live forever with its finest men in hostile hands. There was a first experiment in cooling the blood. In the year after Delium, the parties agreed to a truce of 1 year that paused operations and allowed embassies to travel without fear. During this truce, the Athenians tried to recover Sione and succeeded at Mende. Brasidas continued to hold Amphipolis and to cultivate allies in the north. The truce showed that both sides wished to test the possibility of a larger accord. It also showed how difficult it is to stop a war once the habit of arms and the tally of grievances have taken hold. The decisive turn came with the battle that ended the careers of the two loudest advocates of continued pressure. Cleon sailed north with a force to retake Amphipolis. Brasidas, who had been wounded earlier in the year at the small town of Argilus, planned to meet him with a swift and unexpected stroke. The ground on the Strymon near Amphipolis was broken, with slopes and river bends that favored a commander who would not fight as a parade general. Cleon reconnoitered carelessly and began to withdraw when he realized he could not easily force a decision. Brasidas seized the moment. He led a sudden charge down a steep road against part of the Athenian line, while Clearidas sallied from the city to strike the other wing. The Athenian force broke. Cleon was killed in flight. Brasidas received a mortal wound in victory. He died soon after and was honored by Amphipolitans as a founder. The news traveled to both capitals with the force of a double thunderclap. Two men who had driven policy by temperament were gone. The field was clear for those who favored an end to the first act. Nicias moved quickly. He understood that an opening had been created by shared exhaustion and by the removal of men whose names stirred anger. He also had a personal motive. He hoped to return Spartan prisoners in exchange for terms that would protect Athens from further land devastation and allow the empire to heal. Pleistouanax and the Spartan ephors judged that the time was right. They feared that Persia might again become an actor if the war dragged on, and they wished to quiet discontent among allies who doubted the profit of continued struggle. The agreement that bears Nicias's name was framed to last 50 years. The parties pledged to return most of the places taken in the recent campaigns. Prisoners were to be released. Sacred sites were to be open and respected. Delphi was to be independent. Arbitration was reaffirmed as the method for future disputes. The letter of the treaty required that Amphipolis be restored to Athens and that Pylos be returned to Sparta. Here, the trouble began at once. Clearidas and the communities of the north had no wish to see an Athenian garrison again on the Strymon. Corinth and Megara disliked the terms. Boeotia and Elis refused to swear. The treaty, therefore, became a peace in name, rather than a full reconciliation of leagues. It was propped up with side agreements. Sparta and Athens swore a separate alliance that allowed one to call on the other for help if a third party attacked. Hostages were exchanged and forts were promised back on schedules that ambassadors fussed over with lists and seals. In Athens, the treaty was carried by the weight of Nicias's reputation and by the real desire of citizens to end annual invasions and the bleeding of treasure. In Sparta, it was carried by the wish to recover men taken at Sphacteria and to end the daily humiliation of raids out of Pylos and Cythera. For a few seasons, the larger war paused. Tribute lists continued, but fleets stood down from constant patrol. The markets of Piraeus grew busy again. Farmers in Attica replanted vines and counted how many years would be needed to see olives bear. In Laconia, guards still watched the shore, but the pace slackened. Yet the peace was never secure. The clauses about Amphipolis were not fulfilled. The demolition and return of certain frontier forts became points of contention that clever men used to inflame old suspicions. In the Peloponnese, a new political weather formed as Argos, long a rival of Sparta and not bound by the alliance, gathered a coalition that would soon challenge Spartan preeminence. In Athens, a brilliant and restless citizen named Alcibiades looked at the map and saw opportunity in the fractures that the treaty had not healed. Even so, the Peace of Nicaeas deserves its name. It bought time for the wounded to be brought home, for prisoners to see their families, for treasuries to breathe, and for statesmen to weigh the costs of the years already lost. It stands in the narrative as a narrow bridge between two storms. On that bridge, men spoke of arbitration and of the independence of sacred places. On that bridge, the old confidence of Athens recovered just enough to dream of a Western venture that would test the limits of fortune in a way no Greek city had attempted before. The uneasy peace had cooled the din of battle, but it had not cooled ambition. Athens, in the later years of the truce, looked out upon an empire that reached from the Hellespont to the Cyclades, and judged that its strength depended as much on reputation as on walls and fleets. The tribute lists glinted with regular entries, and the clerks who carved them believed they were writing the grammar of order. Yet beneath the orderly columns lay the simple fact that some communities paid because they feared to do otherwise. The question before Athens was whether a neutral island that refused alliance and tribute could be allowed to sit in the middle of Athenian lanes as a reminder that one could say no. Melos was small, wealthy in stone and pasture, and proud. It was a colony of Sparta in Dorian tradition, yet it had remained formally neutral through the long rivalry. Its leaders traded on that neutrality and on long friendship with the Peloponnesians. They believed that justice among Greeks would protect a harmless island that meant no harm to anyone. They believed that kinship with Sparta and the sentence of common opinion would restrain the great city on the Ilissos. The assembly in Athens read the matter differently. From the Pnyx, Melos looked like a defiant dot on an Athenian map. The island sat within the circle of Athenian patrols. It declined to enter the League. It might shelter enemy ships in a future war. It allowed the idea to grow that membership was optional. So, in the summer that historians place in the year 416 before the Common Era, a force of Athenians with allied contingents sailed to Melos and landed without pretense that they came as mediators. The commanders summoned the Melian leaders and proposed a plain choice: alliance on Athenian terms or destruction. It was not a demand drafted by sophists. It was power speaking through soldiers and ships. The Melians asked for private talks, and the Athenians agreed to the formal conversation that Thucydides placed in the center of his book, a dialogue that later ages have read as a study of power and conscience. The Melian leaders spoke first for the moral order they thought still held in Greece. They argued that justice is a coin that circulates among all, not an ornament worn by equals alone. They believed that the gods look with favor on the moderate, and that men admire and assist those who refuse a shameful surrender. They believed that Sparta, bound by kinship and reputation, would not allow Athenians to treat Dorians like enemies when no injury had been given. The Athenian commissioners answered with a clarity that has rarely been equaled in the record of statecraft. They said that justice is in dispute only when power is equal, and that the strong do what they can while the weak accept what they must. They said that the gods and men alike honor strength, and that it is not piety but prudence that preserves cities. They warned that hope is a poor investment when weighed against ships at anchor in your harbor. The exchange was not a courtroom debate. It was a negotiation under the shadow of siege works. The Athenians offered to spare the island if it would enter the empire as a subject ally, pay tribute, and allow an Athenian garrison. The Melians refused. They trusted to luck, to divine favor, and to the possibility that Sparta would send help across the water. The Athenian commanders then began the work that experience had taught them to do well. They encircled the town with a ring of fortifications that faced both inward and outward. The inner line tightened a noose. The outer line guarded against relief from sea and from the hills. Garrisons rotated through the lines as the season wore on. The Melians made sorties at night, cut supply parties, and cheered minor successes that showed the island had not yet bowed. A supply ship from elsewhere in the Cyclades slipped through and brought grain and confidence. A small party of men made it out to seek aid. For a few weeks, the island lived on the energy that comes from resistance. Athens did not break the siege with a single blow. It applied pressure with engineers and with accountants. Ladders rose where the wall was low. Mines were dug where the rock allowed. Watch fires signaled along the Athenian works each time the islanders tried to cut the line. The discipline of a maritime empire accustomed to sieges on islands prevailed over local courage. In the last phase, the Melians suffered betrayal within their gates. A faction either opened a postern or weakened the defense at a crucial point. The Athenians forced entry, and the remaining defenders withdrew to inner positions. There was no prospect of relief from Sparta. The island was a long sail from Peloponnesian harbors and was surrounded by ships that had learned to close a ring and keep it closed. The terms that followed are recorded in the spare sentences that do the work of a bell. The Athenians put the adult males to death. They sold the women and children into slavery. They placed their own settlers on the land. The island that had spoken for neutrality became a lesson about empire and fear. There was no theater of triumph. There was administration. Assessors counted households. Surveyors measured fields. A garrison officer wrote to his superiors about timber and stone. The news moved across the Aegean, and each city heard it in its own key. Some heard justice for a stubborn island that had invited ruin. Others heard a warning that resistance to Athens would be expensive beyond calculation. Why did the Athenians choose severity at Melos when elsewhere they had accepted submission on milder terms? Part of the answer lies in the theater of reputation. The peace years had emboldened allies to complain, and had given ambitious men in Athens space to think about ventures beyond the familiar map. Policymakers believed they could not afford a neutral outpost inside their circle at the very moment they were asking distant allies to keep faith. Part lies in fear of contagion. If Melos could stand apart, perhaps Thassos or Chios or a city on the Hellespont would think about testing the same claim. Part lies in the psychology of a democracy that had survived plague and invasion and had rebuilt its pride through a string of naval successes. The city believed itself strong and believed that strong cities must be obeyed. Sparta did not sail. The reasons were practical and political. The Peloponnesians were not a sea power. Corinthian triremes could fight bravely in confined waters, but the broad sea lane to Melos was the home ground of Athens. Sparta had no desire to risk citizens in an expedition that did not promise a decisive change in the war. Allies in the Peloponnese were already uneasy about the costs of past campaigns. To send a fleet against an island that had chosen defiance at the edge of the Athenian network would have been a gesture for honor that might end in a wreck at sea. The Melian dialogue entered the tradition as a philosophic parable. To contemporaries, it was also a memorandum about the corrosion that long conflict brings to the habits of a people. The city that had once spoken of freedom for Greeks now wrote orders that sent auctioneers to list families for sale. The generals who had once weighed the value of leniency in the Mytilenean debate now signed warrants for mass execution. The assembly that had thought of justice as a common language now spoke about necessity and example. Thucydides does not say that religion died in the streets of Athens, but he does show how the worship of fortune replaces piety when men convince themselves that a city is the sole maker of its fate. There were Athenians who hesitated. Nicias and others of sober caste understood that terror does not rule for long without cost. They did not prevail. A different voice had grown louder. Alcibiades walked the streets of Athens with confidence and argued that the city must look west if it wished to keep what it had gained in the east. The spoils of Melos were counted, even as the assembly debated sails and rations for a fleet bound for Sicily. The coincidence is not accidental. The moral that Athens drew from Melos was that when strength is applied with resolution, others yield. The lesson that history drew was that when a city convinces itself that necessity absolves policy, prudence soon finds itself without a seat at the council table. Melos did not decide the war. It did define its next act. The island became a signpost for allies who asked whether Athenian friendship was safety or a silk rope. It became a whisper on quays, where men asked whether Sparta would ever master the sea. It became a memory that followed commanders to Sicily, where hubris and miscalculation would write their record in a harbor far larger than any in the Cyclades. In the ledger of empire, the line that reads Melos is short and severe. In the narrative of the war, it is the point where Athens put aside the last veil and looked at itself in the light that power throws, and did not turn away. The decision to send a great armada to Sicily was born in a chamber full of maps and confidence. The spark came from the quarrel of two western cities. Egesta, pressed hard by its neighbor Selinus and by the shadow of Syracuse, asked Athens for help. The envoys told of silver reserves and promised to fund a campaign that would repay itself. They flattered the Athenian sense of destiny. They said that Syracuse was a Dorian city that would one day stand with Sparta. They said that if Athens wished to keep the advantage it had won in the Aegean, it must show itself in the far west as well. The assembly opened a debate that has been rehearsed ever since by students of strategy. Nicias spoke first for caution. He did not deny the value of alliance with Egesta. He denied the feasibility of a war conducted across such distances against the greatest power in Sicily. He advised that if Athens went, it must go with the largest force it had ever mustered, with siege engines, cavalry horses hired on the spot, and a treasury deep enough to maintain the fleet for years. He warned that Syracuse and its friends could summon allies, and that the Peloponnesians would read an empty harbor at Piraeus as an invitation to strike. Alcibiades answered with energy. He said that empire lives by movement and shrivels when it stands still. He said that Syracuse was rich and that if it fell, all Sicily might be open to Athenian influence. He invoked the record of daring that had brought Athens from Salamis to the walls of Piraeus and to the list of cities that paid tribute. The vote went to Alcibiades. Then, in a twist that seemed like a sign to men who read omens for a living, a nocturnal outrage shook the city. On a single night, the faces of the small stone gods that stood on street corners were smashed and mutilated. The Hermae were not only markers of piety, they were boundary stones of identity. Panic broke through the porticos. Suspicion fell on young men of fashion who mocked old forms. Charges followed that sacred rites had been profaned in drunken parody. Alcibiades was named among the guilty by enemies who had long waited for a chance to cut him down. He asked for a trial at once. His opponents insisted that he sail with the expedition and return later to answer at leisure. The armada departed in a spectacle that Thucydides describes with a severity that barely hides awe. Ship after ship slipped from the quays. Oars beat time to the flute, and the decks glittered with newly polished bronze. Citizens and metics and islanders came to watch a procession that looked like a festival and a demonstration of state power in one. The fleet that left Piraeus counted among the largest gatherings of triremes ever sent from a Greek harbor. It carried hoplites and archers, stonecutters and carpenters, interpreters and surveyors, and the confidence of a city that believed its seamanship could bridge any distance. At Corcyra, the three Athenian generals made their first major decisions. Nicias urged a test of Egesta's claim to wealth and a sober reading of Sicilian politics before a siege of Syracuse was even discussed. Alcibiades pushed for immediate boldness. Lamachus, the third general, a soldier of talent and few words, proposed a rapid strike on the city while surprise lasted. The armada advanced to Rhegium and then along the Sicilian coast, taking soundings and gauging walls. The discovery at Egesta was bitter. The silver on display had been borrowed for the occasion. The coffers were shallow. The expedition would have to pay its own way. Before a first blow could be struck, the city recalled Alcibiades to stand trial for sacrilege. He put in at a friendly port, slipped from custody, and fled to Sparta. His defection turned the campaign into a painter's study in irony. The man who had pressed for the expedition now became an advisor to those who most wished to see it fail. In Sparta, he urged two measures that would bruise Athens with surgical precision. He advised that the Spartans should fortify a post in Attica to be held year-round. He advised that they should send a competent commander to stiffen Syracuse. In Sicily, the Athenians moved to encircle their main target. They took the heights of Epipoli and began the patient labor that besiegers know well. They built a wall of circumvallation to cut Syracuse off from help, and raised counterworks when Syracusans tried to block them with lines of their own. For a time, the effort went briskly. The Athenian camp grew secure. Syracusan cavalry worried the workers, but could not break their rhythm. Then the Spartan officer Gylippus landed. He brought few men, but he brought a plan and the authority to reorder a dismayed city. He drilled the Syracusans in line of battle and showed them how to use their cavalry against Athenian detachments. He built a cross wall that bit into the Athenian line and forced them to fight for every spur of rock on the heights. The turning point on land came at night. Demosthenes arrived from Athens with a strong reinforcement and with orders to finish the work that had dragged through changing seasons. He led a night assault on the Syracusan positions along the ridge. In darkness and dust, the attackers lost formation. Units did not recognize friends in the press, and a panic began where a breakthrough had seemed certain. The Syracusans held. The Athenian dead lay along the slopes in a pattern that marked the path of their confusion. Demosthenes urged Nicias to withdraw while the fleet was still intact. Nicias hesitated. He feared the judgment of the assembly and believed that Syracuse was near collapse. He waited for omens to improve. The delay was fatal. At sea, a different drama was unfolding. The great harbor of Syracuse is broad, but not boundless. Once the Syracusans stretched a boom across its mouth and stationed ships on either side, the Athenian fleet found itself fighting in confined water. The maneuvers that had brought victory in the Corinthian Gulf required sea room. The Syracusans modified their prows to withstand ramming and favored grappling and boarding where their heavier infantry could make a difference. The Athenian crews were tired. Their ships had spent months at sea without proper careening. When the Syracusans pressed an attack in the harbor, the Athenian line bent and then broke. A desperate attempt to force a passage out failed amid wreckage and shouts that echoed from stone quays to marsh. The last act took place on the roads that lead inland through limestone country. Nicias and Demosthenes agreed to abandon the siege and retreat by land toward Catana. They formed their remaining hoplites and tried to keep order among thousands of followers who had sailed as rowers and now marched as fugitives. Syracusan cavalry harried the rear. At the Acinarus River, the Athenians rushed to drink and to cross under missile fire. Formations dissolved in the water. Slaughter followed. Demosthenes, cut off with a large body of men, surrendered. Nicias, sick and exhausted, was captured days later after hoping to negotiate. Both commanders were put to death by Syracusan decision-makers who feared that mercy would be read as weakness. Many prisoners were herded into the stone quarries where the sun burned by day and the night cold made bones ache. Some were sold into private slavery. A few escaped over time through the help of Sicilian friends or through the price of their skills as artisans or entertainers. Most never saw Attica again. The scale of the disaster is difficult to exaggerate. The armada that had left Piraeus with celebration did not return. Ships were sunk, burned, or captured. The flower of Athenian youth and the hard core of its professional sailors died on alien soil or in captive yards. The material loss was enormous. The moral loss was greater. A city that had believed it could take distant victories through will and money and seamanship learned that the combination of a determined enemy, a gifted foreign commander, and its own delays could break even the best designed machines of war. Thucydides, the exile who watched from a distance, wrote that this was the greatest action of the war and perhaps the greatest undertaken by Greeks in recorded time. He meant not greatest in achievement, but greatest in scale and reversal. He admired the magnitude of the plan and its ruin. He admired the endurance of the men who held the heights and the edge of the water until they could not stand. He admired even the ruthless clarity of Gylippus, who made a city stand when its citizens were close to despair. The consequences reached beyond Sicily. News traveled to the Peloponnese that Athens had lost a fleet and an army. Allies who had paid tribute with clenched teeth began to whisper that the empire could be challenged. Sparta stiffened its resolve, took the counsel of Alcibiades, and prepared a post in Attica that would bite into the Athenian economy every month of the year. Persia watched from the eastern satrapies and considered how best to use gold to shape a Greek war without spending Persian blood. The long conflict that had paused under the peace of Nicias resumed with a new ferocity, and the city that had thrown a net over a Sicilian harbor would now find a net thrown over its own roads and mines. The ruin at Syracuse carried its own echo. It struck walls in Athens and came back as a sound that was part grief and part calculation. The city had lost ships and men and the prestige that had deterred trouble at the edges of empire. There was no time for ceremony. In the spring that followed, the Spartans chose a new method and fixed it like a spear in the Athenian heartland. At the council of Alcibiades, now an advisor to their cause, they marched to the northern edge of Attica and fortified the hill town of Decelia. King Agis oversaw the work. Stone rose into towers. Ditches were cut. A permanent garrison was installed. For the first time in living memory, enemies could watch Attic roads through winter and summer. The yearly ritual of invasion became a year-round occupation. The effects were immediate and unsparing. The silver mines at Laurion were choked off. Ore could not be hauled. Smelters fell cold. Merchants stopped lending against future shipments. The long walls still bound city to port, but caravans that once moved freely from field to market now ran a gauntlet and often did not run at all. Allied grain could still come by sea, and that saved Athens from collapse. Yet the rhythm of life inside Attica changed to strain. The country folk who had returned to farms during the peace were driven back within the walls. Slave laborers who worked the mines and fields saw an open road to the Spartan lines and took it. Ancient writers speak of 20,000 who escaped. The number is a sign of scale rather than account, but the shock was real. Athenian accounts of revenue show a drop that no decree could repair. The Spartans had chosen their post well. From Decelia they could raid at will and destroy stores at harvest. They could intercept messengers and strip travelers of coin. They could block the road to Oropos and make Euboean traffic more costly to protect. They could force Athens to keep a field army in place every season, and to station watch posts at intervals along the long walls. For a city that had defined its strategy by the decision to avoid land battle, the presence of an entrenched enemy within a day's march of the city was a change of nature. It demanded money in constant streams. It demanded nerves that could pay out month after month. The second blade of the Spartan plan was sharpened in Asia. For years, the satraps of the great king had watched the Greek quarrel with interest. They saw a chance to recover authority over the Ionian cities, to weaken both coalitions, and to spend gold rather than Persian lives. Tissaphernes governed in Lydia and Caria. Pharnabazus governed in the Hellespontine region. Each opened a door to Spartan envoys. In the year after Sicily, the Spartans concluded agreements that promised pay for sailors, ship timber, and safe stations, in exchange for a Persian claim to hegemony over the cities of Asia. There were several treaties, and they were not identical. They show a process more than a single bargain. The constant was this: Persian gold would fund a Peloponnesian fleet. Here, the war changed element. Athens had ruled the sea because it had trained oarsmen for decades, and because its tribute system kept ships in repair and crews paid. Now Sparta built or hired ships in the Ionian yards and filled benches with men lured by regular pay. The first admirals were not yet masters. Astyochus held command, and then Chalcideus and others. Their fleets were cautious at first, and did not hazard the open Aegean without care. Still, the very existence of a well-funded enemy fleet in the east forced Athens to divide attention and to dispatch squadrons to seas that had seemed secure. The Ionian cities watched the balance. The great island of Chios judged that the moment had come to break with Athens. Its wealthy merchants and noble houses were weary of tribute and of the daily discipline that Athenian officials imposed. With Peloponnesian ships now promised, and with Persian silver on hand, Chios revolted. It was the richest subject of Athens, and its defection sent a tremor through the empire. Erythrae and Clazomenae followed. Miletus opened its gates to a Spartan admiral. The coastlands that had been the pride of the Athenian system now demanded a navy to restrain them. Athens answered with the speed of a state that still possessed skilled captains and the habit of command. A fleet under Strombichides and other commanders sailed east. It harried Chian holdings on the mainland, fortified a post at Samos, and clung to points that could not be surrendered without opening the sea wide to the enemy. Samos proved decisive. Its people, long at odds with their own oligarchs, chose loyalty to Athens and became the main base for Athenian sea power in the Eastern Theater. From Samos, the Athenians held councils, employed leading exiles from hostile cities, and kept a fleet in being that could challenge Peloponnesian squadrons in the islands and along the Asian shore. Tissaphernes played a complicated game. He paid late and in small sums, and used promises to restrain Spartan zeal while he measured developments elsewhere. He courted Alcibiades, who now tried to steer Persian gold to the side that would restore him to influence. The Spartan admirals learned that Persian paymasters were a new kind of ally, generous in talk and careful with coin. Pharnabazus, by contrast, proved more reliable. He wanted the Hellespont under his hand and understood that ships and bases mattered more than wheels of diplomacy. His shores would become the scene of fights that determined control of the grain route from the Black Sea. The Athenian state endured the new pressure by resorting to expedients that reveal both resilience and strain. The reserve of 1,000 talents that Pericles had once set aside was touched with reluctance. Old ships were patched and launched. New forms of naval finance were adopted, with wealthy citizens asked to share the burden of fitting out triremes rather than bear a single triarchy alone. Veteran captains were given wide discretion to recruit rowers wherever they could find them, and to pledge back pay in expectation of future assessments. The port of Piraeus was still a living machine. Sheds for ships rang with mallets. Rope walks turned out miles of cordage. Armorers mended helmets and hammered out greaves for marines who would board and fight at the prow. On the water, the first significant tests went against Athens and then began to steady. At Miletus, an Athenian force tried to invest the city and was met by a Peloponnesian fleet. A close fight and the uncertainty of Persian support led to a withdrawal. The Athenians turned to reinforce Samos and to secure nearby islands whose harbors were essential as watering points and winter stations. The Peloponnesians took Teos and stirred revolt on Lesbos. The map of the Aegean that had once been painted in Athenian blue became a patchwork that changed with each season, and each pay chest from a Persian court. In Attica, the presence at Decelia never relaxed. The garrison harried the countryside and stood as a constant insult to Athenian pride. To feed the city, the assembly doubled efforts to guard the Euboean ferry and to shepherd grain convoys from the north. Athenian squadrons in the Hellespont protected the narrow waters with the intensity that men reserve for a lifeline. The sea route to the Black Sea was the artery that kept bread on tables. Without it, the long walls would be prisons. The drama of this phase is not measured by a single battle. It is measured by a network of pressures that brought Athens to the brink without pushing it over. Sparta adopted a strategy that respected Athenian strengths and ignored old formulas. It did not demand a decision at the Dipolon Gate. It struck the mines. It placed watchfires within sight of the city. It invited Persia into the game. It built a navy where a navy had not been its habit. Athens answered by showing that a maritime state could absorb shocks if it kept its ships in commission, and if it could still find allies who valued the protection of a disciplined fleet over the promises of new patrons. The story at Samos deserves emphasis. There, the Athenian fleet and a loyal population created a counter-capital. Decisions were taken on the decks of triremes and under awnings on the quay. Democratic leaders of Samos stood with democratic sailors from Athens and held a line against Spartan and Persian pressure. It was a rehearsal for the political storms that would soon rise in Athens itself. It was also a sign that the empire had within it communities that chose Athens for reasons beyond fear. They chose it because they believed a navy that kept the sea also kept a kind of order that allowed trade and work to go on. By the close of these years, Athens was tired but unbroken. Decelia glowered. The Ionian coast smoldered. Persian, silver-fed shipyards that had once served only the League of Athens. Yet, an Athenian fleet still lay at Samos. An Athenian guard still watched the Hellespont. The treasury still found means to keep oars in the water. Sparta had learned new arts and had gained new partners. Athens had learned to fight on a narrower margin. The next turn of the war would test the city from within as well as from without, for strain at the frontiers had begun to seep into the assembly and into the councils of the fleet. Strain at the front bled into the assembly. In the year after Sicily, the city felt poorer, more crowded, and more easily swayed by men who promised a shortcut out of danger. The post at Decelia was a stone in the shoe that never stopped rubbing. The Ionian revolt demanded ships in the east and money that was counted coin by coin. In this climate, a group of influential men proposed a cure that would change the constitution first and the war second. They spoke in the language of necessity. They said that empire had been won under the guidance of the few, and that empire could be saved only if the few again directed policy without the turbulence of daily debate. Peisander and Antiphon became the faces of this movement. Behind them stood wealthy citizens who had borne repeated naval burdens and envied the swiftness with which Spartan councils decided. Their plan rested on two claims. First, that the great king could be brought to support Athens against Sparta if a narrower government replaced the democracy. Second, that the navy at Samos and the generals in the east would accept a change of regime if it promised steady pay and a path to victory. Alcibiades, living by his wits between Spartan camps and Persian satraps, encouraged the plan with promises that Tissaphernes would release subsidies once the democracy was set aside. The plot ripened while the city fought to hold its sea lanes. In Euboea, discontent broke into open revolt. The Spartan admiral Agis moved quickly. A battle near Eretria ended with Athenian captains outmaneuvered and their crews scattered. Euboea passed out of Athenian control. This loss hurt more than a defeat in some distant strait. The island lay a short sail from Piraeus and had long been a granary for Athens. It was a rude proof that the city could be struck close to home even while it fought far away. In Athens, the conspirators acted. Armed clubs appeared at night. Assembly meetings were managed by fear and by the presence of paid bodyguards. A council of 400 replaced the old council of 500. They promised a broader body of 5,000 citizens to share power in time, but in practice a narrow group drafted decrees and directed embassies. Antiphon wrote speeches of chilling logic in defense of the change. Phrynichus, sharp and suspicious, argued that Alcibiades would ruin any cause that trusted him and that Athens should seek survival by hard bargains rather than by the return of a brilliant exile. Dissenters were killed in alleys or driven into hiding. For a few months, Athens, cradle of public speech, spoke in whispers. The fleet at Samos would not submit. Sailors and marines gathered on the beachfront, swore an oath to stand by one another and the democracy, and set up a council of their own. Thrasybulus and Thrasyllus emerged as leaders who could both fight and persuade. They recalled Alcibiades to the camp and gave him a chance to prove that his claims about Persian favor were more than talk. He advised the sailors to hold Samos as a second city and to strike at the Peloponnesian fleet wherever it appeared in the Hellespont. He assured them that Tissaphernes would not let Sparta grow too strong. Much of this was maneuver rather than guarantee. But at Samos, the union of a loyal island and an Athenian fleet became a political fact. The democracy had moved to the decks of triremes. The war in the north gave the sailors work at once. In the narrows near Cynossema, the Athenian fleet under Thrasybulus and others met a larger Peloponnesian force, supported by Pharnabazus on shore. The fight was fierce and confused among headlands that hid lines until the moment of collision. The Athenians steadied their center and rolled up an enemy wing. It was a small battle in numbers, but a large one in effect. It showed allies that Athenian seamanship remained a living skill. Soon after, near Abydos, the Athenians again held the straits after a day of hard ramming and boarding that left timbers floating for miles. These actions restored a measure of confidence and kept open the path that brought grain from the Black Sea to the kitchens of Piraeus. Meanwhile, the regime of the 400 faltered. The promise to broaden power to the 5,000 was not kept. The men who had seized the machine of government quarreled among themselves over embassies and over the control of fortresses. A plot to hand the harbor of Piraeus to Spartan ships was rumored and then feared as real. Citizens marched to the walls and seized the fort at Echianaia to prevent any such betrayal. Phrynichus was struck down by assassins in the street. Under pressure, the 400 dissolved, and a more inclusive body of 5,000 took authority. This moderate regime, which mixed property qualifications with wide civic participation, stabilized the city for a season and then gave way to a restored democracy. The shift back to old forms did not erase the memory of the coup. It did show that a maritime state with an armed fleet could not be ruled by men who lacked the love and fear of those who rowed. At sea, the Athenians attempted something bolder than tactical recovery. In the spring after Abydos, a coalition of Athenian commanders, including Alcibiades, Thrasybulus, and Theramenes, lured a Spartan fleet under Mindarus, away from his base, and into waters near Cyzicus. A feint drew the enemy out. Then a hidden division appeared behind him. The Peloponnesian line was caught between hammer and anvil. A storm added to the confusion and drove damaged ships to shore. Athenian marines landed and fought on the beaches, while triremes rammed at anchor cables and dragged enemy hulls away under a hail of missiles. When the day ended, the Spartan fleet had been destroyed or captured. A letter that Pharnabazus sent home summed the matter with bare truth. The ships are gone. Mindarus is dead. The men are hungry. The victory was total enough that Sparta sent envoys to ask for peace. The terms they offered would have left the empire broken. The assembly, heartened by success and by the return of revenues along the Hellespont, refused. The months that followed were a busy repair yard for Athenian fortunes. Byzantium, which commanded the mouth of the Bosporus, was taken by stratagem with the help of local friends. Grain moved again with fewer escorts. The fleet wintered better. The city recalled Alcibiades and welcomed him in a ceremony that played to memory and to hopes for a final turn in the war. He brought with him money and the prestige of victory. For a time, his counsel carried weight, and his presence steadied allies who had doubted that Athens could protect them. None of this erased the facts at Thessalia or the new realities in Ionia. Persian silver still paid Peloponnesian benches. Satraps still weighed the war as a balance to be managed. Tissaphernes alternately promised and delayed. Pharnabazus prepared new squadrons and fortified stations that would let Spartan admirals try again in the straits. Inside Athens, the treasury still counted copper as well as silver and still asked rich citizens to shoulder the cost of rigging and crews. Yet the city had pulled itself back from the edge. It had survived the loss of Euboea, a palace coup, and naval defeats. It had re-established a fleet of quality at Samos and in the Hellespont. It had proved once more that the skill of its oarsmen and the quick judgment of its captains were resources as real as mines and tribute. By the year that closed with the return of Alcibiades, Athens stood bloodied but upright. The countryside was still cut by Spartan raids from Thessalia. The allies in Ionia still watched Persian money with interest that was more than financial. But the navy was again a living thing. The democracy was again in its place on the Phoenix. The Hellespont was again guarded by men who knew its currents as farmers know seasons. The next act would test whether that recovery could endure a new series of battles in eastern waters and whether leadership in Athens could keep discipline when victory and pride tempted it to break its own rules. The recovery that Athens had carved out of misery began to fray in the narrow waters of Ionia. In the late summer of 407 before the Common Era, the fleet entrusted to Alcibiades suffered a reverse near Notium after his subordinate Antiochus disobeyed orders and offered battle to Lysander. The loss was not ruinous in ships, yet it shattered confidence in a commander who had carried the hopes of the city. Alcibiades left the camp and did not again hold supreme command at sea. The door opened for Sparta to try new methods with an admiral who thought about war as a series of traps rather than a procession of formal battles. Lysander was that admiral. He cultivated the friendship of Cyrus the Younger, the Persian prince who governed the western satrapies for the great king. With Persian silver, he could pay rowers on time and at a rate that kept benches full. He reorganized port discipline and trained pilots to fight in the way that best suited the hulls then in Spartan service. He learned the habits of his opponents and watched for the moment when hunger or routine would dull their edge. Athens struck first with a furious effort that showed the old seamanship was not dead. In the waters off the Arginusae Islands in 406, the Athenian fleet under a board of 6 generals won a great victory. The Peloponnesian line was beaten back, and many enemy ships were taken or sunk. A storm then rose and made rescue work treacherous. The effort to save men from shattered hulls was delayed and then abandoned. The city learned of triumph and tragedy together. Political passion burned through the deliberations that followed. 6 victorious generals were tried together and put to death for failing to rescue survivors. The effect on morale and on the pool of experienced command cannot be measured precisely, but contemporary voices tell that a city already short of steady leadership at sea had executed several of its most competent officers in the moment of need. Sparta recalled Lysander to the front by a stratagem of titles. The law did not allow a second term as admiral. He returned as secretary to a nominal commander and in fact held the tiller. He went back to Cyrus and secured funds. With that chest, he gathered ships in the eastern Aegean and then moved north with speed and care. His object was not a parade fight. It was the grain road. The Hellespont is a strait of currents and narrow shores where a fleet can starve a city without fighting before its walls. Lysander struck Lampsacus on the Asiatic side and took it by storm. The town yielded stores and a harbor. From Lampsacus he could look across at the European shore, where the Athenians soon appeared and beached their fleet at a poor roadstead called Aegospotami. The site offered little shelter and no city behind it. Water and firewood lay at a distance. The Athenian captains chose it because it stood opposite the enemy and promised a short sail to offer battle. They made a daily routine. They rowed out in order toward Lampsacus, challenged the Spartans to come out, and when Lysander would not stir, they turned back to their beach, drew ships ashore, and sent crews out to forage. Advice came to them from an unexpected quarter. Alcibiades, who watched from a fortified estate nearby, rode down to warn that the anchorage was miserable and that men who must leave their hulls daily to fetch supplies would be caught one day with ships half-manned. He urged a shift to the harbor of Sestos a few miles away. Some captains listened, most did not. They had faced Lysander for days and he had refused battle. They believed they saw caution or fear. In truth, they saw patience. On the 5th day of this ritual, Lysander set his plan. He ordered his crews to take their oars and sit quiet. Scouts watched the Athenian line shove out, form, and then return to the beach. When the Athenian hulls were beached and the men had broken rank to eat and wander, a fast cutter at the mouth of the Lampsacus harbor hoisted a signal. The Spartan fleet launched in silence and crossed the strait with all speed. It fell upon the Athenian ships as men ran from tents and fires. Some captains managed to get free and push into the water. Most were taken where they lay. The few Athenian triremes that had remained habitually afloat, including the flagship of Conon, tried to rally a defense. Conon saw at once that the day was lost. He cut away and escaped with a handful of ships to Cyprus and to the court of Evagoras. The rest were trapped on the beach or taken as they floated without full crews. Numbers given by ancient sources vary, but the loss was enormous. Close to the whole Athenian fleet in the Hellespont was captured with men alive aboard. Lysander showed a cold purpose afterward. He executed most of the Athenian prisoners and their allies, with the stated ground that they had murdered prisoners earlier in the war. He spared the general Philocles for questioning, and then put him to death. He spared the citizens of Lampsacus who had suffered when the city fell. He did not waste time on speeches. He sent a fast dispatch south with the news, and then began at once to gather the fruits of victory. The strategic effect was instant. With the enemy fleet destroyed in the straits, the cities that guarded the grain road opened their gates to Lysander or were compelled in short order. Byzantium and Chalcedon changed sides. Garrison after garrison took money and marched out. Tribute that had once gone to the Acropolis began to flow the other way. The empire that had been held by the labor of oars and the arithmetic of assessments dissolved almost without a fight once its shield at sea was gone. In Athens, the news arrived with the force of a winter squall. There were no more ships to send. There were no crews to man them. The grain convoys would be cut as soon as the enemy wished. The city ordered the last usable hulls to guard the harbors and set boys and old men to watch posts along the walls. It was a city that had been built to be a sea power and now faced the sea as a barrier. The chain that led to Aegospotami can be traced in hard facts. A careless provocation at Notium that cost a leader. A great victory at Arginusae followed by a political act that thinned the bench of tested captains. A Spartan admiral funded by a Persian prince and shielded by a flexible legal formula. A deliberate move to the grain strait. A poor anchorage chosen for speed rather than safety. A routine that became a habit and then a vulnerability. A signal on a cutter and a sprint across a narrow sea. The capture of ships that carried the last hope of a maritime empire. The larger meaning belonged to the old strategist who had died years earlier. Pericles had built a plan on walls and on a fleet, and he had said that if the fleet were ever lost, the city was lost with it. At Aegospotami, that sentence became a fact in the lives of men who had once beat time to the flute on the decks of 100 triremes. What remained for Athens was endurance behind stone, and a last attempt at diplomacy when allies would measure promises against hunger. After the trap at Aegospotami, the war moved with the logic of hunger. Lysander rode the victory north and south along the straits, taking cities that had once guarded the grain road for Athens: Byzantium, Chalcedon, and the stations that watched the Bosporus yielded or were compelled. Tribute that had climbed the Acropolis for a generation now turned and flowed to Spartan allies and to Persian paymasters. In Attica, the post at Desileia bit deeper. With the Hellespont closed, the mills by the Ilissos slowed, and men watched the harbour mouths as if food might appear by an act of mercy. Lysander sailed for Piraeus in deliberate stages, gathering surrendered ships, garrisons, and hostages, and leaving Spartan governors and boards of 10 in city after city. These Dicaches and Harmosts became the new pattern of rule across a Greece that had tired of democratic assemblies, yet would soon find foreign overseers a different burden. King Pausanias marched with the Peloponnesian levy to the walls of Athens. The circle tightened by land and sea. There would be no last relief fleet and no secret convoy slipping through the net. What Pericles had feared had come to pass. Without a fleet, a maritime empire was a walled town with not enough bread. Inside Athens, the experience was of a city drawn down to silence. The countryside had been abandoned years earlier. Now even the bustle of Piraeus lost its voice. The assembly met more to measure rations than to measure policy. Conon sent word from Cyprus that a handful of ships had escaped but could not lift a siege. The reserve fund that had once been 1,000 talents had melted under the long strain. The citizens stripped temple roofs of gilded plates and borrowed sacred dedications to keep the watch paid. In winter and early spring, the diet fell to thin barley cakes, and then to less. Thucydides does not describe these months. Xenophon and later writers tell of the slow famine that brought men to the gates to stare at the enemy fires. Spartan allies arrived before the walls, with demands that carried as much rage as strategy. The Corinthians and Thebans urged that Athens be razed and its people sold. It was not only hatred born of long rivalry. They recalled Melos and Sione, and the tribute collectors who had once ruled with a bronze face. The Spartans chose a different road. They calculated that to destroy Athens would place too much power in the hands of allies who were already too loud. They calculated also that a humbled Athens might still serve as a check upon Thebes and upon Corinth. The record preserves a sentence that they did not forget the Athenian part in the struggle against the Persian king. Whether gratitude or self-interest weighed more, the result was the same. They would spare the city on strict terms. The terms that reached the assembly were severe and plain. The long walls that bound city to port and the fortifications of Piraeus were to be destroyed. All ships were to be surrendered save 12. Exiles loyal to Sparta were to be restored. The empire was to be abandoned and subject cities released. Athens was to become an ally of Sparta and follow the leadership of the Peloponnesian League in peace and war. There would be Spartan oversight to guarantee compliance. No Greek doubted what these clauses meant. The city that had claimed to be free of all masters would now take orders from a rival state and live without the sea as shield. The date of capitulation fell in the spring of 404 before the Common Era. The work of demolition began at once. Later writers describe the scene as a festival. Flutes played while work gangs pulled stones from the long walls and heaved them down. Men who had once marched along those circuits to the comfort of safe harbors watched the lines broken and felt the protection of 2 generations fall in dust. At Piraeus, the masts of surrendered triremes stood bare, their rigging gone, their bronze rams already pried away as trophies for victors or melted down for coin. It was not a sack. It was a careful unmaking of the material facts that had made Athenian power. Lysander presided with a cold efficiency that matched his conduct at sea. He did not leave a vacuum. In city after city, he had installed oligarchic boards and Spartan governors. In Athens, he sponsored the rule of the 30. This council, dominated by Critias and by a few allies, promised order and the rescue of the city from what they called the excesses of the masses. Their first acts were confiscations and proscriptions. Property of political enemies was seized to fund a new regime. Men who had spoken for the democracy were arrested and executed. Metics with wealth were convenient targets. The 3,000, a roll of privileged citizens, formed the legal shield for the council. Those not on the list could be killed without trial. Those on it could be expelled from it, and then meet their end in a court that pretended to ancient forms. Theramenes, who had helped design the moderate government of the 5,000 during the crisis years, at first sat among the 30 and tried to soften their edge. He soon saw that Critias meant to rule by terror and to use the pretext of Spartan favor to settle local scores. The Council of Moderation drew suspicion. In a scene that later Athenians remembered with bitterness, Critias brought Theramenes before the council and the roll of the 3,000. He denounced him as a traitor to the new order, struck his name from the list, and ordered him taken to the prison. Theramenes called upon the gods and the laws and drank the hemlock with a composure that became part of the city's memory of that dark time. Outside the walls, the Spartan net remained. Harmosts oversaw posts in Attica and along the routes that had once fed Piraeus. In the islands and along the Asiatic shore, the Dicaches did what Lysander expected of them. They enforced payments and watched for democratic agitation. Persia did not interfere. The satraps kept their money moving to those who could keep the Hellespont quiet. The balance that had favored Sparta after Aegospotamy was preserved by institutions that could punish quickly and did not answer to local assemblies. Daily life in Athens adapted to a rule that mixed official proclamations with the fear of informers. Friends met in private rooms rather than in the agora. Philosophers who had debated justice now watched justice replaced by decrees written to fit a victim. Exiles gathered in Thebes and in other towns that offered refuge. The city still had plays and sacrifices, but the mood had turned from proud seriousness to a guarded quiet. If there was music in the streets, it was the music of men walking in twos and speaking softly. Some Spartans did not like what they had made. King Pausanias was more cautious than Lysander. He saw that naked rule by a small group would provoke a reaction, and that the allies would not be satisfied to police Athens forever. He returned more than once to inspect the settlement. Even among Spartans there were rivalries that would soon matter. For the moment, the arrangement held. The long walls were down. The navy was gone. The city's voice in the councils of the Greeks had been reduced to a whisper. The fall of Athens did not look like the sack of a city by a foreign host. Temples were not burned. Women and children were not sold. The buildings stood in their white clarity under the Attic Sunday. The humiliation lay in the removal of the means by which the city had made itself powerful, and in the presence of rulers who used Sparta's name to enforce a narrow will. It lay also in the knowledge that the end had not come through a glorious fight at the gate, but through a chain of misjudgments at sea and a final collapse of the fleet for want of caution in a narrow strait. In time, the story would turn again. Exiles gathered strength. The rule of the 30 would overreach and provoke a civil war in miniature. A new compromise would be hammered out under Spartan mediation. The democracy would be restored, and men would swear not to remember wrongs. But that belongs to the next act. The chapter of surrender ends with a city that had once commanded a league now watching others command, and with the sound of flutes fading as stones settled into ruined heaps along a road that had joined Athens to its harbor. The surrender of Athens did not bring a Greek peace. It exchanged one weight for another. Sparta held the keys of the mainland and sent its officers into the cities. Lysander placed boards of 10 and Spartan governors from the Hellespont to the Cyclades. Tribute and fines once carved beneath the Acropolis now clinked into Peloponnesian chests. The new order announced itself with short decrees and sharper swords. In Athens, the 30 ruled by confiscation and fear. Their reach exceeded their prudence. From exile at Thebes and in Attica's hills, Thrasybulus gathered men who refused to accept a city of informers. They seized the fort at Phyle in winter, defeated a Spartan garrison at Munichia above Piraeus, and drove the 30 from the city. Critias fell in street fighting. King Pausanias marched north and chose statesmanship over terror. He brokered a settlement in the summer of 403 before the Common Era that restored the democracy, confined the oligarchic remnant to Eleusis, and brought the garrison home. The Athenians swore a remarkable oath not to remember past wrongs. This act of amnesty preserved a wounded polis from a cycle of revenge. Sparta's own house soon shook. Lysander had become a prince in all but name. His Dicaches answered to him more than to the kings. A backlash followed. The ephors clipped his wings. Rivalry between the royal houses sharpened. Agesilaos, small in stature and great in ambition, became king and took a view that looked east across the sea. He proposed to lead a crusade of Hellenes into Asia to humble the satraps who had bought Greek fleets with Persian gold. He sailed to Ephesus and trained an army with a severity that impressed even enemies. His advance unsettled the balance that had favored Sparta at home. The reaction came from Greece rather than Persia. Thebes, Corinth, Argos, and a restored Athens formed a league against Sparta. The spark was a quarrel in central Greece over Phocis and Locris. The war that followed is remembered as the Corinthian War. Its battles were a chain from Haliartus to Coronea on land, and from Cnidus to the islands at sea. At Haliartus, Lysander fell before the Theban walls. At Coronea, Agesilaus fought his way through a coalition phalanx and brought his men home wounded but unbeaten. At sea, the news reversed Spartan pride. Conon, the Athenian admiral who had escaped Aegospotami, sailed with a Persian-funded fleet under Pharnabazus and shattered the Spartan navy off Cnidus. The sea that had once learned to fear Spartan rams now watched Spartan hulls burn. Conon went on to Piraeus with Persian gold and helped rebuild the long walls. Stone rose again along the road to the harbor, a sign that Athens would be heard in Greek councils once more. The war ended not with a field decision but with a royal letter. The King's Peace, also called the Peace of Antalcidas, was proclaimed in the year number 387. It announced that the cities of Asia belonged to the great king and that all other Greek cities should be autonomous. Autonomy in this formulation meant the dismantling of leagues that might resist Sparta. The peace humiliated Greek pride by recognizing Persian rule over the Ionian Greeks and gave Sparta a legal tool to break coalitions. Sparta enforced the peace with harsh consistency. It broke the walls of Mantinea into villages. It garrisoned Thebes and put its own men in the Cadmea. It ordered Athens to dissolve new alliances that looked too much like an empire reborn. Spartan hegemony did not rest on an abundant treasury or a growing population. It rested on discipline, allies with their own grievances, and a reputation for infantry that still frightened many. The pressure of constant campaigning strained that base. Helots deserted when they could. The citizen body shrank as names were cut from muster rolls by battle and by the strictures of Spartan law. The economy of Laconia did not furnish the coin that a policing empire demands. Sparta could pull down walls, but it could not build consensus. Hatred gathered quietly among those whom Sparta had humiliated in the name of autonomy. Athens recovered with the craft of a maritime city that had learned caution. It formed the Second Athenian Confederacy in the late 300s with a charter that renounced tribute and clerices and promised equality to allies. The League raised a fleet that kept pirates and ambitious governors at a distance. Athenian merchants returned to the Black Sea route. Piraeus again hummed with foreign tongues. The democracy learned to balance pride with prudence, though its public men still quarreled over taxes and strategy as the theatre season demanded. Thebes prepared a more radical answer. Young officers trained in the sacred band and studied the tactics of deeper files and oblique advance. Epaminondas and Pelopidas gathered a cadre that could think as well as fight. In a bold winter raid, they freed Thebes from a Spartan garrison by striking at the Cadmea with disguised partisans and exiles. The liberation changed the weather at once. Thebes built a new league in Boeotia and called men to remember that autonomy could mean the right of a region to order itself, not merely the right of Sparta to tear up a neighbor's charter. The reckoning came on the plain of Leuctra in the summer of 371. Epaminondas placed his strongest troops on the left, stacked his files deep, and advanced that wing to crush the Spartan right, where the king and the best citizens stood. The Spartan line, trained to even depth and to meet equals head-on, could not absorb the blow. The royal guard broke, the king Cleombrotus fell, and the myth of Spartan invincibility ended in a sudden quiet. News traveled across Greece that the city which had ruled by the spear had been beaten by a new thought and a new formation. In the years that followed, Thebes invaded Laconia and freed Messenia, a stroke that bit into the heart of Spartan wealth and manpower. Sparta did not recover. The strategic map after Leuctra looked nothing like the map at the end of the Peloponnesian War. No single city could impose a general peace. Athens tended the sea. Thebes ruled the central mainland for a time. Corinth protected its isthmus and its trade. Sparta nursed pride and looked to the past. Persia resumed its careful watch and was content to see Greeks balance Greeks. The long conflict that had begun with a quarrel over alliances had yielded to a looser competition of rivalries that none could close. In that looseness lay the opportunity of a northern kingdom that had watched and learned. The costs of the long war were visible everywhere. Farms in Attica and Boeotia showed old scars. City treasuries collected smaller rents from poorer tenants. The number of free citizens fit for service declined. Veterans limped through markets and told stories to boys who would soon be called to stand in files of their own. The great experiment of concerted Greek freedom had survived the Persian storm only to fall into quarrels that drained the strength of all. The kingdom of Macedon would soon take the field with a reformed phalanx and a treasury that used gold from its own mountains, and the divided cities would find that their histories had entered a new era. The Peloponnesian War did more than move borders. It altered Greek thought about power, justice, and the limits of civic endurance. Its record survives not only in treaties and casualty lists, but in stone blocks with tribute accounts, in ship sheds whose foundations still mark the shoreline of Piraeus, and in the prose of an Athenian exile who turned defeat into literature. Thucydides wrote as a participant and as an analyst. He set aside the divine machinery that earlier writers loved and traced causes to fear, interest, and honor. He explained that the growth of Athenian power and the alarm it inspired in Sparta made war likely, and then showed how chance and choice made it ruinous. His work became the standard by which later historians measure sobriety. It preserves speeches that reveal how Greeks thought when stakes were highest, from the funeral praise of Pericles to the stark exchange at Melos where necessity spoke with the calm of an accountant. The war also changed how Greeks fought and how they paid for fighting. Hoplite battle had been the traditional image, two citizen bodies closing on a plain with short work, and a decision by afternoon. The long contest replaced that picture with sieges, blockades, and naval stations that kept men from their fields for seasons at a time. Permanent garrisons grew common. Engineers learned to throw walls around a city in weeks. Rowers replaced part-time infantry as the decisive arm in many theaters. The accounts carved in stone reveal how imperial warfare depended on regular revenue, not only on courage. Assessment boards revised quotas for islands and coastal towns with an exactness that would have pleased a banker. In the east, Persian gold entered the ledger. Once the satraps paid, Spartan rowers and Spartan admirals learned to keep a fleet in commission. The technical advantage that had long belonged to Athens could be matched. The social cost spread beyond the cities that led the leagues. Civil strife took root in many communities. Thucydides described how meanings themselves inverted when party loyalty came first. Courage became the willingness to rush into reckless plots. Prudence became a mask for fear. Oaths ceased to be bonds and became tools. Corcyra was the most famous case, but similar storms broke out in cities from the northern Aegean to the Peloponnese. The practice of expelling citizens or killing rivals became a craft that minor leaders learned too well. Refugee networks formed, and factions called in foreign help, which only deepened dependence on the great powers. Economy and demography paid their own price. The plague stripped Athens of a generation and left its mark on habit and hope. Orchards in Attica that had taken years to nurture were cut and burned in annual raids, then replanted and cut again. Silver that once ran in steady streams from Laurion slowed, and with Decelia occupied it nearly stopped. Merchants in Piraeus learned to read the weather of the Hellespont as if it were a calendar, for grain would not come when the straits were closed. In the countryside of many regions, small farms passed into the hands of creditors as war and absence drained families of labor. The citizen rolls of Sparta dwindled to a fraction of former strength. When Thebes later broke the Spartan line on the plain of Leuctra, it did so against a city short of men, even before the first spear was thrown. Culture, however, did not wither. Greek drama and philosophy faced the ordeal and kept working. Aeschylus had died before the war, but Sophocles and Euripides placed on stage the questions that siege and plague had sharpened. Euripides sent Medea and the Trojan women into theaters crowded with men who had seen wives and children carried off in real conquests. Sophocles gave Athens a study in law and conscience with Antigone and showed how a city could blind itself with certainty in Oedipus. Socrates served as hoplite and then returned to question his neighbors in the porches and workshops of the city. His trial a few years after the war reflected a society that had endured turmoil and looked with suspicion on a man who made citizens examine their own claims to wisdom. The link is indirect, but the war forms the backdrop against which that famous case was heard. The memory of the war shaped diplomacy for the next 2 generations. Cities learned to fear single hegemons but could not agree on a stable balance. The king's peace declared all cities autonomous while handing the Ionian Greeks back to the great king. Thebes then broke Spartan pride and freed Messenia, and for a time looked ready to fashion a better order. Athens rebuilt a league with gentler promises that avoided tribute and clericies. Yet mutual mistrust remained the constant. The lessons of Melos and Sione, of Plataea and Mytilene, lingered whenever a council debated clemency or example. Rhetoric learned in the assembly and refined in the courts became a weapon of statecraft as well as a profession. Archaeology gives the material afterlife of these changes. At Pylos, the rough ramparts that Demosthenes raised can still be traced on the headland. On the island of Sphacteria, shards of pottery and bronze fittings hint at the famous capitulation. In the ship sheds of Zea and Munichia, the long foundations where triremes once rested stand in ranks like empty ribs. At Amphipolis, inscriptions name men who administered estates after the war. Even the places of punishment remain. The stone quarries of Syracuse hold the memory of prisoners who recited Euripides to soften the hearts of slave owners and bought freedom with a poem. The war left a canon of maxims that students of politics still quote. Do not expect allies to love you for your benefits to them. Expect them to fear your power and your counsels. Do not take counsel of hope when ships must be provisioned and men must be paid. Do not execute victorious generals in a storm of public anger. Do not promise to hold a distant siege when cavalry harasses your workers and reinforcements have not sailed. Do not assume that a fleet will form in a day if you have neglected the schools where oarsmen learn rhythm and trust. Above all, if your safety rests on command of the sea, guard the habits that keep a fleet disciplined for years, not days. There is also a moral ledger. Athens began as liberator against Persia and ended as master over cities that once called it friend. Sparta rose as champion of freedom and used victory to place overseers and boards of 10 across Greece. Both learned that necessity can become a habit, as dangerous as pride. Thucydides refuses to preach, yet his pages show that men who claim necessity often confuse it with convenience, and that states that abandon moderation in emergencies find it hard to recover the habit when danger passes. The long outcome was a Greece drained of money, and men just as a northern kingdom learned to harness a drilled phalanx with longer spears and to weld horse and foot into a single instrument. Macedon rose in a world where no city could rally others for long. When Philip moved south, he found communities wary of one another, half ready to welcome a protector at the price of autonomy. The war had not made Macedon great. It had made Greece less able to resist a new kind of greatness. Yet the achievements of the Greeks survived the conflict that nearly consumed them. The Parthenon still stood, though stripped and scarred. Drama was still performed. Philosophers still argued. Historians still wrote. The ships were gone and the tribute stopped, but the work that made the names of Athens and Sparta endure did not depend only on fleets and walls. It depended on the stubborn refusal to stop thinking even while the city was hungry, and on a record that tells later ages what it costs when rival freedoms meet without restraint. To tell the story of the Peloponnesian War is to walk through a workshop filled with fragments. The historian does not inherit a single scroll that runs from first alarm to final truce. He inherits voices, stones, timbers, and coins, each carrying a piece of a lost whole. He must learn how to weigh a sentence by Thucydides against a figure cut in marble, how to fit a cracked inscription into a ledger of tribute, how to read the keel marks of a trireme boathouse like a carpenter reads grain. The core voice is Thucydides, an Athenian general who failed to save Amphipolis and was exiled for it. Exile gave him time and a stance outside faction. He collected testimony from both camps. He dated events by summers and winters. He explained causes in a language that makes necessity and fear and honor the drivers of policy. He is spare and difficult, but when he writes about the funeral oration of Pericles, the plague in the crowded streets, or the cold reason of the Melian exchange, he becomes the conscience of the narrative. He stops before the end. The last books break off in mid-season, and we are left looking at a half-finished column that still supports more weight than any later structure placed beside it. Xenophon takes up the thread in a different tone. He writes as a soldier and a man of the world. He is terse where Thucydides is analytic. He is partisan at times, admiring Sparta and giving special attention to the rise of Agesilaus. Yet his Hellenica is indispensable for the fall of Athens, for the rule of the 30, for the first years of Spartan hegemony, and for sea fights where Athenian seamanship flickered and returned. Diodorus Siculus, a much later compiler, preserves useful details from lost writers. Plutarch, writing lives rather than chronicles, supplies character studies of Pericles, Nicias, Alcibiades, and Lysander that illuminate motive and habit. He does not fear anecdote. He will tell you who wept and who smiled. Documents in stone correct and complete the prose. Tribute lists were carved annually on tall stelae and set up in public view. The names of islands and coastal towns march down the face with sums in talents and drachmas. One reads the ebb and flow of empire as if reading a bank book. Decrees on coinage and weights and measures show the empire tightening uniform practice so that Athenian owls, stamped with Athena's head and the bird of night, rang the same in every market from Chios to the Hellespont. Assessment decrees reveal not only totals, but the method of calculation and the magistrates responsible, the Hellenotamiai, whose office desks sat under the shadow of Athena's temple. Archaeology supplies the smell of pitch and the bite of stone. In Piraeus, the foundations of the great ship sheds at Zea and Munichia still run in parallel lines like ribs of a beached creature. Each bay held a trireme on a slip with grooves for rollers and a slot for the bronze ram. The spacing tells the width of hulls and the height of prows. A visitor who stands in those aisles can hear the imagined creak of cordage and the flute that set the stroke for 200 men who pulled as one. At Pylos, the shore shelves show where fire ships grounded, and on Sphacteria potsherds and arrowheads testify to days when hunger and dust turned Spartans into supplicants. The stone quarries of Syracuse, where thousands of Athenian prisoners were penned, are not a metaphor. They are a place where limestone still holds the cool of evening. Topography is a permanent document that corrects rhetoric. The long walls from city to port were not lines in a speech. They were measured corridors of stone and ditch that let a city survive while fields burned. The narrow water at Sybota, the open sweeps near Naupactus, the cramped harbor of Syracuse, and the treacherous shore at Aegospotami explain victory and ruin as surely as any oration. A map without relief lies. A commander who read ground as a text could make 10 ships defeat 20. Numismatics records empire in metal. The Athenian tetradrach, with its almond-eyed goddess and stiff-winged owl, circulated so widely that cracked examples are found far from Greek speech. Wartime coinage shows debasements and emergency issues. In the last years, one finds bronze coins plated with silver. A poor man's substitute for the old pure owls. An echo of a treasury that had spent its reserve. Spartan coinage, austere and slow to change, tells a different fiscal story. A city wealthy in land and poor in coin, until Persian chests made a navy possible. Institutions are sources when their machinery is preserved. The trierarchy, the obligation by which a rich citizen fitted out a warship, can be tracked through lawsuits and decrees. One learns how hulls were assigned, how crews were paid, and how captains were praised or punished. In the later war, the burden grew so heavy that Athenians pooled the duty across companies of taxpayers rather than place a ship on one set of shoulders. The liturgy of theatre funding, the chorigia, sits beside the trierarchy in the civic ledger. A city that financed plays and fleets from the same class of donors reveals a culture where art and war drew on the same purses and trained the same instinct for public display. Even religious practice leaves a factual trail. The mutilation of the Hermae on the eve of the Sicilian sailing is not only a scandal in speeches. It is a case file with depositions, a campaign of arrests, and the flight of a general who would advise his enemies how best to hurt his city. The Delian sanctuary where the League treasury first sat retains dedications that record the moment when lofty purpose gave way to administrative habit, when a pan-Hellenic alliance became an Athenian bank. Method matters. Where our authors disagree, the historian asks who was present, who had reason to flatter, who wrote for a patron, who copied whom. He asks whether a reported speech captures a line of policy rather than a verbatim moment. He watches for moralizing that glows a little too warmly. He takes seriously a figure cut in stone. He does not let a fine anecdote outweigh a ledger's worth of numbers. He submits all to the geography of a headland and the draft of a harbor. Out of this labor, certain facts grow clear. Athens made war possible by revenue that arrived on schedule and by a discipline of the sea learned over decades. Sparta learned the sea by borrowing coin and commanders, and then by enforcing obedience through boards and garrisons. Persia preferred to buy influence rather than ships, until ships purchased with its coin sailed under a Spartan flag. The war changed Greece because its duration forced every city to invent a way to live through years when fields were not the sole measure of wealth. What endures is the example of inquiry that the war produced. Thucydides turned calamity into a method. He replaced comfort with analysis. He made later readers suspicious of easy answers. He taught that to understand a city at war, one must read its accounts, listen to its enemies, and pace its walls at dawn before the market opens. He left us a model for telling any story where choices by flawed men meet forces larger than any decree. Stand on the Pnyx at sunrise, and the city seems eternal. Marble glows, swallows wheel, and the Saronic water is a calm sheet of silver. Yet the ground underfoot remembers. The Peloponnesian War left grooves in Greek life that 1,000 festivals could not smooth. It ended one world and prepared another. The war settled a question of method. It proved that a sea empire can be built on assessments, ship sheds, and trained rowers, and that it can be destroyed in a week when pay fails or discipline slips. It taught that an infantry power can learn to fight on water if it can borrow a treasury and hire the right teachers. It taught that the longest spear is not always a pike on a field, but the credit that keeps men at their benches through winter and storm. It left experiments that would outlast the fleets that launched them. The amnesty of 403, sworn when the democracy returned after the rule of the 30, stands as a political invention of high order. A city that had bled and hated chose to draw a veil across recent wrongs so that neighbors could look one another in the eye. The Second Athenian Confederacy promised no tribute and no garrisons, and showed a chastened awareness that allies are not subjects unless fear makes them so. Spartan boards in the cities demonstrated how occupation by friends can feel like foreign rule, and why autonomy proclaimed from afar can be a mask for hegemony. The war also changed what Greeks thought worthy of remembrance. In temples and stoves, men had praised collective valor in set phrases. After the plague and the sieges, they asked darker questions. Why do good intentions sour in the press of necessity? How much cruelty can a city justify by invoking survival? The Mytilenean debate and the Melian exchange became, in effect, civic mirrors in which later councils measured their own faces. The verdicts that followed Arginusae became warnings that anger is a poor judge in a storm. There were quieter legacies. Craftsmen refined ship construction to a high art. The curvature of a trireme ram, the angle at which bronze and oak met sea, the spacing of thole pins, and the tension of sail all reached standards that builders in later centuries studied with respect. Engineers learned to raise a wall around a town in weeks, to throw mounds over ditches, to mine under towers, and buttress their own foundations against countermines. Quartermasters invented routines for convoy, ration, and pay that read like the table of contents of a modern manual. Art did not retire from the world. It reported it. Vase painters placed scenes of boarding fights beside scenes of marriage and harvest. Dramatists wrote lines in which the chorus spoke the exhaustion of a city that had watched processions turn into funerals. Philosophers built inquiries that still bear the impress of long strain. The Socratic method itself, with its refusal to take an easy premise, can be read as a reaction to years when slogans carried men to bad ends. The largest legacy lies beyond Greece. The war cleared space. Thebes showed that new tactics can break old reputations. Athens showed that a humbled city can recover skill and measure. Sparta showed that victory without money cannot govern a restless world. Into the space came Macedon, with a court that learned Greek letters and a king who understood how to bind horse and foot into a single instrument. When Philip marched, he found city-states wary of one another and used that wariness to step past them. When Alexander sailed, He carried in his baggage the notebooks of men who had measured currents and the ledgers of men who had learned to feed armies far from home. Even the language of statecraft changed. Later, ages made simple tags from complex experience. People speak of a trap named for Thucydides, as if a single sentence could explain a century of rivalry. The history refuses such ease. It shows that fear can be managed, that choices matter, that arrogance and panic do as much harm as structural forces. It shows that leadership can fail by excess as surely as by timidity. It shows, finally, that the fate of a city is written in habits long before it is written in battles. The stones are still there. On Sphacteria, the scrub is green again. At Amphipolis, the Strymon moves as it always has. In Piraeus, the lines of the ship sheds mark out a forest now empty of hulls. Walk those aisles, and you can almost hear the drum that kept 200 men in time. That rhythm is the honest end of the story. The war was not only enacted by famous names in council and on the field, it was made each day by citizens who kept a beat, by farmers who planted vines again after the enemy left, by women who kept households alive on ration bread, by craftsmen who forged bronze even when the city had little coin left to pay them. The Peloponnesian War is not a monument that tells us to admire or lament. It is a record that asks us to think. It asks whether a people can hold power without devouring itself, whether rivals can accept limits, whether law can bind pride when danger awakens it. It asks how a community remembers its own mistakes without losing the will to act. Those questions outlast the ships and the walls. They are the inheritance of anyone who cares what it means to govern and to be governed.